Dead Smart. Written by Stephen Puleston. Narrated by Joseph Tweedale. Chapter 1. Wednesday, 8:30 a.m. Eddie Westford's steel-grey hair, the consistency of blow-dried wire wool, cascaded around his shoulders, passing the gaping, bloody wound that stretched over his neck. His jet-black beard had been carefully trimmed, and clumps of wispy white hair were scattered over his chest. There must have been a lot of blood, and looking down at him on the gurney in the mortuary brought to mind the disgust in the voice of the young sergeant who'd reported the discovery of the body near the Cardiff City Stadium the previous evening. Dr. Paddy McVeigh, the pathologist, hummed along to some orchestral music thumping in his earphones. I caught the stale smell of second-hand alcohol on his breath, which reminded me that I hadn't touched a drop for over a year. But the memories of when the bottle ruled my life still cast hard shadows over my mind. Once Paddy had finished his preparation, he paused, and gave me a smile of eager anticipation. I always like to see a man happy with his work in life. He tugged at the leads hanging from his ears, and the sound of violins filled the air until he fiddled with the handset and the noise died. "Quite the specimen." Paddy's Irish accent made the body sound like an experiment from a Dracula movie. "I don't think I've seen a corpse with so much hair before." I made an exaggerated gesture of looking at my watch. As the senior investigating officer, I should really be in the incident room by now, especially as the cause of death was glaringly obvious. "Can we get on with this?" I said. Paddy reached for a scalpel and made a deep incision in the body. Boyd Pierce, standing by my side, gave an uncomfortable cough and thrust his hand to his mouth. Newly promoted to detective sergeant, he had a sensitive stomach at the best of times, and I frowned at him, hoping a silent reprimand would prevent the contents of his stomach reaching the mortuary floor. He gave me a weak shake of his head before leaving the mortuary seconds later. The post-mortem was completed quickly enough, and Paddy stood back and gave the corpse a satisfied, contented look before sighing. "Massive blood loss," he said, nodding at Westford. "It must have been a very sharp knife by the look of the wound. I might be able to give you a better idea once we've looked at it in more detail." "When can you send me the report?" "I'll do what I can later today, but there's a multiple fatality from the motorway I need to get to grips with, and the coroner wants that dealt with as a priority." I nodded and left Paddy before finding Boyd sitting in the pool car, head propped back against the restraint, the window open a few inches. He stirred when he realised I was standing outside. I leant against the front wing and lit a cigarette, the second of the day, and let the smoke fill my lungs as Boyd left the car. "I don't do blood," he said. "It's part of the job." Boyd knew that every SIO should attend a post-mortem, and I wondered if he was cut out for working on a murder inquiry. "Give me time, boss." I nodded and finished the cigarette, knowing the investigation into a series of burglaries from my apartment in the Bay would have to wait. There would be hundreds of passers-by and dozens of possible witnesses, which meant a public appeal for witnesses. We drove back to Queen Street as I mentally ticked off my ever-increasing to-do list. 12:30 p.m. "What do we know about him?" I said. Boyd pinned a sheet of A4 to the board in the incident room, with Westford's name printed on it in a large font. He stepped back and pinned up another sheet that I recognised as the result of a police national computer search. "He works for the city council in the gardening department, and he's got form." Really? It shouldn't have been a surprise that Westford's violent death might be connected to a life of criminality. "He's been involved in the Cardiff City Soul Crew. He was convicted 5 years ago, and for a while was banned from their games." The Soul Crew were a bunch of mindless thugs that enjoyed random violence inflicted on the supporters of teams playing Cardiff City football team. They've been behind a number of violent assaults over the years, and continued to be a menace to Cardiff and the police. That must have rankled. Any family? "He was separated from them, but he has an ex-wife and a child." "Have they been informed?" Boyd nodded. "Family liaison are there now." "We'll need to build a picture of his life. Work colleagues, friends, family, money." Boyd's clean white shirt, neatly knotted tie and the navy suit jacket hanging from the coat stand suggested a determination to make faster progress up the ladder than I had managed. I admired his approach, but didn't share his ambition. He'd been working with me for a few months, and already he had polished some of my rough edges. His telephone rang. A frown creased the skin around his eyes. He caught me glancing at my watch, so he finished up. "The family liaison officer assigned to Westford's ex-wife thinks we ought to speak to her." I thought about everything else I needed to organise. I needed to speak to the officers who had arrived at the scene. I should check progress with the crime scene investigators. Superintendent Cornock, my immediate superior, would expect a report, and I needed to speak to him about an appeal for possible witnesses. I could feel my eagerness to make progress growing, but I knew I had to prioritise. The victim's family were always the first place to start any murder inquiry, even when the family was estranged. "Tell her we'll be there as soon as we can." 4 p.m. The small terrace where Kylie Westford lived in Adamstown had a run-down feel. Nothing on the walls except peeling wallpaper in some corners, no personal knickknacks in cupboards. Other than her name, Kylie Westford had nothing in common with her Australian namesake. She was at least 14 stone with the build of a sumo wrestler and the dress sense of a gorilla. The shiny black leggings looked like they were about to burst, threatening to spill their contents all over the cheap sofa where she sat. I shivered at such a prospect, and got back to asking her about her ex-husband. "When did you see him last?" She shrugged, briskly. "Dunno, can't remember. Must have been when he picked up Hartley." "Hartley?" "My boy." She beamed, and some of the jowls around her neck quivered rhythmically. "How old is Hartley?" 10. He really loved his dad. Eddie took him to the football sometimes." "Did he see Hartley often?" She blew her nose, now using a tissue she extracted with thick fingers from a dainty box decorated with pink flowers. "Once every couple of months. Whenever there wasn't a home game, he was a fucking shit father." Boyd, sitting on a chair nearby, gave her a kindly look, the sort that wanted to be shocked by her cursing while sympathetic at the same time. I thought about my son. I hadn't seen Dean for... I realised that I couldn't recall. I couldn't even remember what he looked like, and I wondered if that qualified me for uber shit father. "How's he taking it?" Boyd tilted his head towards her. "He's with my sister, Charlene." She nodded to the door from the sitting room to the rear of the property. I wanted to ask her if there were any other characters from Neighbours going to appear, but thought better of it. "Do you know if Eddie had any enemies? Someone who might want him dead?" She curled her lips into a frown. Boyd added, "Or maybe someone he owed money to." A shake of the head this time. "He was always short of money. He spent everything on supporting the Bluebirds. We never had a holiday, never even a day trip down to Barry Island." She cast her gaze through the window. Tell a lie. We had a weekend in some poxy French place when Cardiff were playing. The food was crap and nobody spoke English. I just sat in the hotel bar getting pissed." "Does he have any other family?" I said. "His mother got remarried a few years ago and went to live in Southend, and he's got a sister, Janet." "Do you have her contact details?" She reached into her bag and fumbled around before producing her mobile. Boyd jotted the details down in his notebook. "His father? Drank himself to an early grave. He was a lazy, useless bastard, best of times." Happy families. "Did you notice anything different about Eddie recently? Did he seem worried?" "Like what?" "Worried, Kylie, like something was on his mind." "Nope." "Was there anything different about him?" She fidgeted with her mobile. "He sent me selfies the last couple of months. He looked a right idiot, smiling at the camera as though he was rich and dead smart." I glanced at Boyd, guessing he was thinking the same as me, that this was a complete waste of time. She thrust the mobile towards me, and I looked at the pictures on her phone. I barely recognized the face of Eddie Westford. He had crooked teeth I hadn't noticed that morning, but the smile was a temporary fixed grin forced for the occasion. I looked beyond him towards the cabin of the car he was sitting in. I couldn't tell what sort of car it was, but it looked expensive. Leather seats and a glistening fascia. There were 3 photographs of Eddie in 3 different cars. "Did Eddie tell you where these were taken?" "Don't be stupid. You could be a real knobhead sometimes." I looked down again at the images. "Did he tell you who owned these cars?" She snorted. "Of course not. It was bound to be something to do with Cardiff City, though. He spent nearly all his time there with one thing or another." When things seem out of place, the likelihood is they are, and seeing him behind the wheel of an expensive vehicle ticked that box. I need copies of these. Chapter 2. Thursday, 9:30 a.m. Boyd pinned 3 pictures to the incident room board before giving me a contented smile, the sort a newly married man would make at the prospect of returning home. The first one is a Maserati. He pointed to the vehicle at the start of the lineup. How can you tell? Boyd's smile turned into a smirk, and he lifted a finger towards the inside of the cabin. You can just about see the Trident emblem on the steering wheel. I've made an appointment to see the local dealer tomorrow morning. Hopefully, he can tell me which model it is. And the others? One looks like a 6 Series BMW, and the other is probably one of those 4x4 Porsches. I could see that Boyd was planning a trip around all the luxury car dealers of South Wales. Both German brands were commonplace in Cardiff, where it seemed that everyone had a 3 Series BMW of some description. Before every home game, the executive car park at the Cardiff City Stadium seemed full of expensive sport cars, and on one occasion, I'd seen a small group of men and boys gathered around a red Porsche 4x4, with matching red brake calipers exchanging fawning glances and no doubt technical information about its performance. So why is Eddie Westford driving 3 high-end cars? Boyd stepped back from the board, and for a moment we stared at the photographs. Either they were stolen, or... He was driving them for a friend? Boyd managed to sound unconvinced. The prospect that Eddie Westford had any friends who could afford anything more than a Ford Focus seemed remote. The logical explanation, maybe the only explanation, was that Westford was involved in the thefts of these cars. But Eddie was a low-end criminal. He would never be able to mastermind the theft of high-end cars in this way, which meant someone else was involved too. But who? I'll get started on identifying car thefts in South Wales, and you go and speak to Westford's supervisor in the council. Boyd nodded. I returned to my office and scooped up the telephone handset. The unit dealing with car thefts had been scaled down and eventually closed, and the morning passed in a flurry of activity as I tried to track down an officer who had been part of the squad. I spoke to an inspector I had met on a training course who told me that, as priorities had changed, the unit wasn't an effective use of police resources, which was code for saying that the insurance companies could investigate themselves if they wanted, in the certain knowledge this sort of cut to policing wouldn't get press attention. You might ask Jack Collins in operational support. He coordinates the reports of car thefts. I thanked him and rang off. Eventually I tracked down Collins, a civilian working in headquarters. I need information on car thefts reported in Southern Division. I heard the sharp inhalation of breath. Why? Because I desisted from reminding Collins I was the police officer and that he had to understand the proper chain of command. It is part of an ongoing investigation. Every theft complaint is referred to the nearest station, so there's no central register. More air sucked through teeth. It depends. Sometimes it'll be on the computer. When was the car theft squad disbanded? 2 years ago. Who's in charge then? Inspector Robinson, but he retired and the sergeant who worked with him got transferred on promotion to the Special Branch unit in Pembroke Dock. What was his name? Scott Baldwin. Tracking down Baldwin proved a difficult task. Various telephone calls led me nowhere, until a tired voice at the end of the telephone told me she'd put me through. Can't help you, Inspector. I'd wasted hours, and I wanted to shout at someone. You should try and search for car thefts. Mind you, that's no guarantee. Is there nothing else? Well... I rang off before he could give me another vague reply. I tried every combination I could think of to establish how many Maseratis and BMWs had been stolen in Cardiff in the past 3 months, getting more and more irritated with my lack of progress. Boyd could finish the task, I decided, as the uniformed sergeant who had discovered Eddie Westford appeared at the door of my office. An hour spent with him proved equally frustrating, as he recounted his frantic efforts to gather witnesses from a football crowd weaving its way home. I've got some of my lads taking statements from the stewards outside the ground, but it could be time-consuming. There must have been thousands of people in the grounds. Just over 12,000. I checked. I frowned. It was a poor attendance for a home game. He left soon afterwards, and I sat back in my chair before reaching for my telephone and calling Alvine Dix, the crime scene manager.
"What do you want?"
she said. "An update on the Westford killing."
"It was in the middle of the car park at the football stadium, for Christ's sake. We've got DNA samples everywhere that we need to eliminate. It's going to take ages yet."
"Call me when you have anything." She started to complain again, but I finished the call and left my office for a scheduled meeting with Superintendent Cornock, knowing that I had to build a picture of every recent high-end car theft in South Wales in order to make progress, and we still had to build a picture of Westford's personal life. Thursday, 2:35 p.m. Over a hurried lunch at my desk, I watched the lunchtime news. Cornock had been as good as his word, and a brief piece asked for anybody present at the football stadium with information to come forward. Boyd was stuck in the council offices being given the runaround by a task I knew would have frayed my nerves, so I headed to Westford's flat. I parked and walked up to his apartment and let myself in. Standing in the hallway, I noticed the scuff marks on the wall and the skirtings grey with age. A stale smell of second-hand cigarette smoke hung in the air. The decor in the sitting room wasn't much better. A two-seater tan sofa had been pushed against one wall, and opposite was an old Lloyd loom chair painted a vivid blue. I scanned the rest of the room. Everything had been painted various shades of blue. The walls, the ceiling, even the carpet was a shade between navy and sapphire. Draped on every wall were flags and scarves belonging to Cardiff City Football Club. As a season ticket holder, I counted myself a fan of the Bluebirds, but not even I could have imagined the devotion Westford must have had for the team. Framed photographs of some of the greatest strikers who had played for Cardiff lined a shelving unit. Underneath were dozens of DVDs and videos stored in neat rows, highlights of various football games that Cardiff City had played. Stepping into the victim's home was always helpful. I wanted to smell the environment, picture him at home. I moved into the kitchen where I opened various cupboards. They had all the usual requirements of Spartan living: ketchup, brown sauce, and various tins of soup and dried noodles. I moved a jar of cheap instant coffee to one side and spotted a packet of tea bags spilling its contents. I wasn't sure what I was hoping to achieve with this domestic inspection, but it always felt necessary in helping me to get to know a victim. Westford's home made me realize how incongruous the image of him sitting in a Maserati actually was. I wondered if there might be other images kept on a computer or on a mobile telephone, so I rang Alvine, who confirmed what I suspected.
"We didn't find a mobile telephone."
Everyone has a mobile telephone, so I wondered where Westford's might be. If his assailant had taken it, there must have been a reason. I wondered if Westford had a laptop or a PC he used, where he might store other photographs, so I started searching. Half an hour later, I had finished moving the contents of shelves and cupboards, upending sofa cushions, but had still found nothing. Apart from a suspicion that a missing mobile was significant, and that Westford sitting in various expensive cars meant something. I walked through into the bedrooms. The first had a single bed, a wardrobe and a chest of drawers with a small bedside light. The posters pinned to the wall were images of the footballers that played for the current Cardiff City team. It had a rather sterile feel, as though the room was used for the occasional visit of a young child. Hartley, perhaps. A blue and white duvet was draped over a double bed in the second and larger bedroom. A bluebird scarf hung across the headboard. Various mementos and mugs lined a shelf on the wall. I noticed a pile of programs by the side of his bed, and realized I could have passed the dead man in the Cardiff City Stadium, bumped into him walking out of the ground, or jostled with him as we queued for a chicken pie at half-time. But Westford's throat had been clinically sliced open outside the stadium, which implied it was more than just another gangland killing. This felt personal, professional. I walked around the bed, drawing a finger along the surface of the chest of drawers. The neatness of the duvet and the bedding surprised me, and gave the room a feminine touch somehow. There was a similar order in the drawers of the chest backed up against one wall. The clothes weren't expensive, but they looked clean, tidy. I turned my attention to the rest of the wardrobe. Westford had an impressive collection of the various strips used by the Bluebirds, all neatly folded and stored in the shelves at one end. There was a wide shelf at the top that I couldn't reach, so after returning from the kitchen with a chair, I climbed up and moved various old clothes and shopping bags to one side. I found nothing of interest. After a few minutes, I gave up and started on the boxes at the bottom of the wardrobe. I found a box with payslips and P60s and memos from the trade union Westford had belonged to. Sitting on the edge of the bed, I scanned 3 printed bank statements before flicking through the last few entries on his credit card account. Nothing unusual drew my attention. It was all too normal, but then I remembered the members of the Soul Crew could often be stable members of society with regular jobs and families. Eddie had been killed for a reason. There was always a motive, and the selfies were the only evidence of something that didn't fit into Westford's ordinary life. It made me worried that we had missed some vital clue. I nudged the shoebox aside with my right foot before picking it up and examining the contents. Underneath various papers relating to his divorce was a tenancy agreement for the flat. The document looked professional, and correspondence from Clayton Properties referred to work planned on the outside of the building. The sound of footsteps outside the flat caught my attention. I stopped and looked up over the door, guessing that one of the upstairs tenants was leaving. But there was something else, a presence as though someone was standing, contemplating what to do. I stepped through into the hallway, thinking that this would be an opportunity to speak to one of Westford's neighbours. Then I stopped dead in my tracks as I heard the sound of a key scratching in the lock and muffled conversation. I stared at the door, my mind racing. I hadn't asked Kylie if she had a key, and I tried guessing who else might have access to Eddie's flat. I cursed silently and realised that the door would open towards me, which made it difficult to confront the intruders on the threshold. I let my breathing slow, hoping that I wouldn't be heard. The door eased open. A hand appeared at the edge, and then a shoulder before the person stepped into the flat. I moved, a fraction too early. The man sensed my presence, and he pushed the door towards me. "Fucking bastard!" he yelled. I noticed another figure in the doorway as I lurched to one side, losing my footing. An instant later, he was out of the door, running down the thinly carpeted stairs. I shouted as I careered after them. "Stop! Police!" They reached the front door and slammed it shut. Fumbling with the lock delayed me until I flung the door open and rushed outside. I glanced left and right then. No more than 100 yards down the pavement, I saw the backs of 2 men, one with long blonde hair, so I sprinted after them. They dodged down a side street, and for a few seconds I lost sight of them until I turned the corner and watched as they jumped into a car. I ran into the middle of the road, arms flailing uselessly in the air. But they were gone. Thursday, 4:47 p.m. Can you describe them? Boyd leant over the desk and peered at me. I shook my head slowly. I'd been trying all the techniques normally used to get witnesses to remember faces and features, but nothing was working. One of them had long blonde hair. That's all. I saw the incredulity in Boyd's eyes. I ran my hands over my face, hoping it might help. And he wore a dark jacket. Nothing else. The other one wore a beanie hat and a dark jacket. At least I ran after them. Maybe someone in the street at the time saw something. Boyd sat back in his chair. I shared the skeptical look he gave me. What were they after? There was nothing in the flat. At least nothing I could see. I let the last comment hang in the air, knowing that by late evening the search team I had organised would have finished the task of dismantling every part of Westford's flat. I reached over for the shoebox and tipped out the contents. Scattered among the court papers from his divorce were till receipts from McDonald's in the Bay and the bowling alley nearby. In fact, he had several old McDonald's till receipts and several petrol receipts from various garages, including services on the M5 motorway. The telephone ringing was a welcome distraction. Boyd carried on picking at the various scraps of paper. "Sergeant Ellis, sir." I recognised the voice of the search team's supervisor. "I hope you've got some news for me." "We've just finished, and there was no sign of any computer equipment." I tried to hide my annoyance as I pondered how little we knew about Westford. After Ellis promised me a report in the morning, I finished the call and turned back to Boyd. "How did you get on at the council offices?" Boyd loosened his tie before rolling his eyes. "Waste of time, boss." I raised an eyebrow, waiting for him to continue. "It was as though Westford was invisible. He came to work, did his job, never any trouble, never controversial, never stirred things up, and always did exactly as he was told. It was like listening to the perfect employee record, even though he had a criminal conviction.
It happened in Newcastle years ago, and the papers in Cardiff didn't cover it and the TV didn't pick it up, so it never got major publicity, and he slipped under the radar. The guy knew about it, but afterwards Westford was never in trouble, so it wasn't an issue. Another layer of frustration. I wondered when we might make progress. I picked up the tenancy agreement. "I'll talk to his workmates in the morning," Boyd said. I was thinking about Cardiff's home game at the weekend, and whether we could get any intelligence on the Cardiff City Soul Crew. There was only one way I could manage it that quickly. There's someone else I need to see. Chapter 3. Thursday, 8:14 p.m. Terry sidled into the bench seat opposite me and grinned. "What's the panic, Marco?" Terry had thick dark hair and 3 days' growth of stubble. He'd been a regular informant who had provided me with valuable information over the years. If anyone could tell me about the Cardiff City Soul Crew, he could. Soul Crew. I sipped on my Americano. He took a long mouthful from a pint of brains that left a cream tide mark along the glass when he replaced it on the table. "They're all fucking nutters." A guy called Eddie Westford was killed on Tuesday night. The lack of any reaction told me the name meant nothing to him. Someone sliced his throat open in the car park at the Cardiff City Stadium. I paused, but Terry looked at me unperturbed. Westford was linked to the Soul Crew years ago, and he was convicted of a nasty assault in Newcastle when a group of lads were caught smashing up shops and breaking noses and arms. All the usual stuff. I need information about what's happening now in the Soul Crew, and whether Westford was involved in some way. Things have changed, you know that. There's CCTV everywhere, and tickets for the games are controlled now. The visiting fans are segregated from home crowds, so there isn't a chance for mindless violence and thuggery. Terry sighed, as though it were a major disappointment. They must still be around, though. Terry reached over for his beer and emptied a good quarter. Talking to me was always thirsty work. A pub in St. Mary Street was a regular haunt for most of them. It had one of those jukeboxes that played soul music all the fucking time. It got on my nerves big time. Then he finished his pint and swirled the glass around on the table. He lifted his empty pint glass and looked over at the bar. I got the message, so I trooped off and returned with a refill. Terry gave me a nod of thanks and started on the drink. "I did know a couple of lads involved in the crew years ago. I haven't spoken to them for a while. I don't suppose we'll do any harm to catch up for old time's sake." I finished the last of my coffee. He took another large gulp. "What was his name again?" "Westford." Terry was halfway through his second pint. "It'll cost you." That got my attention. "I'll need a few quid. Grease the wheels. You know what I mean? I'll have to be out Friday night and then before the home game on Saturday. I need to buy burgers and booze." He lowered his voice, leant over the table, and whispered, "And I need to go back for every home game for the next 2 months so it looks natural. I want none of those nutters getting the idea of my grass. And if you do hit the crew, I need to be well clear." I nodded, and reached for my wallet. I fished out 3 £20 notes, and he gave them a forlorn look. "This won't—" "And I need an update next week." He slumped back before reaching for his drink. He finished it in one hit and headed out of the bar, my money giving him a new spring in his step. Chapter 4. Friday, 11:30 a.m. Orchestral music drifted through the car showroom, adding to the restful, sophisticated atmosphere. I suppose that customers who could afford a new car expected a certain level of refinement, and the assurance their wealth was appreciated. One of the 2 salesmen who were both on the telephone when I arrived looked up at me and gave me a cursory smile. Sunlight poured in through the expanse of glass glistening against the gleaming bodywork, and I ambled around 2 new BMWs, pondering how much each cost. Far more than the salary of Eddie Westford would allow. "Can I help, sir?" I found my warrant card, and the "how much can you spend" smile disappeared. I want some help. Now it was my turn to smile. He led me over to his desk, and I produced from the folder under my arm the photographs Westford had sent his ex-wife. "I'm investigating the murder of Eddie Westford." He sat looking at me, wide-eyed. He sent these photographs from his mobile phone, and we need to establish which car he was sitting in at the time. He judged each photograph carefully, and then turned towards me. "It's a 6 Series coupe. You can just about see the soft top." He leant over and pointed a finger at the rim of the passenger window. "And the colour combination is just fabulous. I've never seen it before.
It looks like Mediterranean blue with an ivory white leather upholstery. He let out a sigh like an artist appreciating the glorious sculpture. Did you sell a car like this? He stared at the image and then shook his head slowly. It's a real head-turner. There won't be many of them around. How much would one cost? It depends on the specification and extras. They start at 52,000, and the top of the range is just under 100,000. He made the last figure sound like loose change. I had paid less than a tenth of that for a second-hand Mondeo, and wondered why anyone would want to spend that sort of money on a car. He turned to the second image. At a guess, this is a 5 Series, but there's not enough of the cabin to be certain. He dropped the photograph onto the desk and picked up the first image again, eyeing it with a loving gaze. Where is this car now? If I knew the answer, I would be one step closer to finding Westford's killer. Friday, 1:30 p.m. I chewed the last of my chicken and bacon sandwich before crushing its packaging into a ball and discarding it in the bin by my desk. Boyd appeared at my door with 2 mugs of coffee and then sat down in one of the visitor chairs. How did you get on in the Maserati dealership? The cellophane wrapping of a flapjack I bought with the sandwich was fighting back, so I pulled at it with my teeth. Boyd had a faraway look in his eyes. I sat inside a quattroporte. What did they say? You should have smelt the leather, boss, and the dashboard. Could they recognize the car in Westford's photographs? Boyd straightened, shaking off his daydreaming. I was right. It was a GTS model. The price new is almost 3 times my annual salary. Have any been stolen recently? He shook his head. Dead end, boss. Damn. Somebody has a Maserati that Eddie Westford sat inside. Let's get to work on finding if any Maseratis have been stolen in South Wales, and who owns them. Did you have any success at the BMW dealer, sir? The salesman was convinced one of the images is Westford sitting inside a 6 Series convertible. He could even name the likely colour of the paint as well as identifying the shade of leather used on the seats. We might get a trace from a dealership as to who bought the car. I nodded. Did you have any luck with the telephone numbers from Westford's mobile? Nearly all of them are pay-as-you-go. There are a dozen numbers on monthly contracts. I'm waiting for details of who they belong to. I nodded. It was detective work that could take hours and still produce no leads or any evidence. We finished our coffees after dissecting the little progress we had made before walking into the incident room. Westford's face looked out from the board, but there was little else, no significant leads or even a possible suspect. There was always a motive. It was just a matter of establishing exactly what it was. Even though we didn't have Westford's actual mobile handset, Kylie had given us his number, which enabled us to requisition his call record, and the pages of numbers had arrived that morning. While Boyd worked on the telephone numbers, I concentrated on the preliminary statements from the Cardiff City supporters who had discovered Westford's body. It had been an audacious killing. There must have been hundreds, maybe thousands of people milling around the concourse outside of the stadium, walking home, making their way to cars, heading for the railway station. It was difficult to imagine anyone taking the risk of killing someone in such circumstances. The first people on scene were 2 car park attendants. One of them had dialed 999, and both of them had given similar statements about hearing shouts and then a woman's scream before they rushed over and discovered the body. A statement from a nearby burger van confirmed the place was teeming with people. How could a murder like that simply go unobserved? After the appeal for witnesses had been broadcast on the television news, a team of uniformed officers had been busy taking statements, and 25 had reached my desk earlier. By the beginning of the week, there would be dozens more. My frustration built that nobody had noticed Eddie Westford. But then, how many people do I notice when I leave the stadium and walk back to my flat? People can hide in plain sight if they want to. Through my open office door, I could hear Boyd on the telephone, sharing my annoyance at the lack of progress he was making. I broke off from reading statements and found the number for BMW's UK office. 15 minutes later, I was talking with a woman who had a deep voice and a warm Irish accent, telling me she would be delighted to assist, but they'd need a formal request. I tapped out an email, and I received a reply very quickly, telling me she would get back to me by the start of the week. It was the end of the afternoon when I heard Boyd talking with someone in the incident room. I welcomed the interruption and walked through to see Boyd standing by the board. DC Norman, sir. The young officer had a navy shirt and a navy tie of almost the same shade. I'm working with Detective Inspector Hobbs on a drug-related investigation. He thought you should know that Eddie Westford is a person of interest in our inquiry." Dave Hobbs and I had crossed swords before, and I wondered why it had taken him 2 days to notify me about Westford. There would be a motive behind that, too. Something relating to Hobbs's self-interest, no doubt. "So, what are the details?" Norman spent half an hour telling us they suspected Westford was a small-time courier for one of the drug dealers they'd been targeting. He'd been clever enough to avoid being in the wrong place at the wrong time. He gave a surprised shake of his head when I asked if there was a Maserati owner involved. I thanked Norman once he'd finished, pleased we might now have some more focus to our inquiry, although working with Dave Hobbs was the last thing I wanted. Norman promised to send us a memorandum with details of everyone they suspected of being involved. "What do you think, boss?" Boyd said, once Norman had left. "Once we've established everything about the cars, then maybe we can think about coordinating with Inspector Hobbs's inquiry." I could picture Dave Hobbs's piggy eyes staring at me. It wasn't a prospect I relished. Friday, 8 p.m. Trish was unusually late, and I sat in the leather seat in the bar area of a new pub in the bay, nursing a sparkling water that had a slice of tired-looking lemon floating on top of it. The ice had already melted. She had texted me earlier telling me that a case she had been working on was keeping her in the office. As an intelligence officer in Eastern Division, her professional life rarely crossed with mine. I watched her passing the window looking flustered, and she gave me a harassed smile. It meant she was stressed, and that meant she could be short-tempered. "God, I need a drink," she said, after grazing my cheek with a kiss. I returned from the bar with a gin and tonic, and she proceeded to down half of the drink in one hit. "My line manager has been a real shit today." I'd been dating Trish since a missing person inquiry had involved me working closely with Eastern Division. She had her own place, but most weekends she stayed with me. Things felt comfortable with Trish, but I wasn't certain if I wanted to make a long-term commitment. And she knew all about my drinking. I listened as she told me about her week. A superintendent had been demanding results from a hard-pressed team, and the level of pressure and hassle had increased, the further down the chain of command it had reached. Even the civilian intelligence officers weren't immune. "They expect us to do twice as much work for the same pay," she said, finishing her drink. Her second G&T disappeared quickly too, as she continued with her rant about the inequality in Eastern Division. "It's a HR nightmare," she said. "They have no idea about man management." It sounded like every department I had ever worked in. "It's Friday night. Try and switch off. Easy for you to say." She slumped back in her chair. An hour later we had finished our main course and were tucking into dessert. The ice cream would never have passed for genuine gelato, but Trish finished her plateful. We paid and left the restaurant, ambling back to my apartment. Trish had forgotten about Eastern Division, and by now had been asking about the Westford inquiry. I gave her the usual non-committal replies that things were at an early stage and that we had no real leads except for the cars. She was surprised when I mentioned the Maserati and the BMW. We reached the flat and unlocked the door and threaded an arm around her waist. After curling her hands around the back of my neck, she kissed me with alcohol-soaked lips. "So, what do you want to do now, Inspector?" I kissed her back. Her tongue met mine. Now all the right signals had been sent. She brushed a hand against the front of my trousers and smiled at me. We walked through into the bathroom, and I ran the shower. I ran my fingers around her breasts and then over her firm nipples. I moved a soapy sponge in circular movements over her back, which she arched under my caress. She squeezed me until I gasped, and we kissed again. I dried her slowly with one of her large towels before joining her under the duvet. Chapter 5. Saturday, 8:30 a.m. I kissed a bleary-eyed Trish curled up under the duvet and left the apartment. After driving into town, I parked and headed for Mario's, where I found a quiet table, ordered breakfast and read the sports pages of the Western Mail. Cardiff City was still languishing in the middle of the table, and there seemed little prospect of them reaching the championship playoffs based on the performances so far that season. My meal arrived, and I put the newspaper to one side. The bacon was salty and my fried egg a little on the runny side, but I dipped a piece of white bread toast into it before sweeping it around the plate. I returned to the sports pages while sipping my Americano. Thankfully, The Cardiff City Soul Crew made few headlines these days, but routine circulars in my email inbox told me about random assaults and violence that were still attributable to the gang members. I was halfway through an article about some of the businessmen linked to the club when Boyd rang my mobile.
Eddie Westford's sister is in reception, boss.
His sister? What does she want?
Not sure, but she says it's urgent.
I'll be there in 10 minutes. I paid, left Mario's, and headed over to Queen Street. A cold autumn wind swirled around the street, and I zipped my jacket up to my chin. I found Boyd in the incident room.
Janet Westwood wouldn't talk to me, he shrugged. I've put her in one of the conference rooms downstairs.
Intrigued by Janet turning up that morning, I hoped she had something important to share. I led the way, Boyd trailing behind me. The difference between one of the conference rooms and an interview room was the absence of a tape recorder screwed to the wall, and a nod towards more comfortable plastic chairs. Janet jerked herself upright and then half stood as we entered before I raised a hand, telling her to sit down. She lowered a bag onto her lap. I sat down opposite her, Boyd next to me.
Detective Inspector John Marco. I reached out a hand.
She nodded, then glanced at Boyd before chewing her lip.
I don't want to get into no trouble.
She had one of the strongest Cardiff accents I had heard for some time. How can I help? I tilted my head towards her and gave her a brief smile.
I know Eddie could get into trouble, but that didn't involve me. He only came to see me sometimes when he wanted something or if he wanted company for Hartley.
Janet, is there something you want to tell us about your brother? She paused, gnawing on a fingernail. She reached down and lifted a bag onto the table.
This belongs to him.
The handles of the bag sagged onto the faux leather material. I reached over. What's inside? Janet folded her arms and then glared at me.
It's got sod all to do with me.
I opened the zip and removed 2 pairs of old jeans, a designer t-shirt, the sort favoured by drug dealers and their minions. On top of a light summer jacket with the same designer logo on the left-hand lapel was a laptop. Instinct made me find a handkerchief from my pocket before I lifted the laptop and placed it on the table. Boyd shifted in his chair. I moved the jacket to one side, hoping I could find a charger, but instead, there were bags of money, all carefully sealed. I turned to Boyd. We'll need evidence pouches. He was already halfway out of the conference room when I added, and some latex gloves. I sat down and looked over at Janet. She was trying a bashful, innocent face. It wasn't going to work. I honed my voice to a nice sharp edge. I need you to tell me everything you know about this bag. Saturday, 11:30 a.m. A thin film of dust covered the laptop, which had pride of place on the table in the forensic lab in the bowels of Queen Street. One of the regular crime scene investigators sat on the stool, with Alvin Dix, the senior crime scene manager, looking over his shoulder.
Is this your breakthrough, Marco?
No matter how hard Alvin tried, whatever she said seemed to have a sarcastic edge. Just tell me if there's anything on there I can use, Alvin. I glanced at my watch, knowing that Superintendent Cornock expected me to join him at another meeting of the Cardiff Partnership Forum, a group designed to coordinate policing, probation services, and the rehabilitation of offenders. Although Cornock had emphasized how important my participation in the forum might be for my career, I had my doubts. Normally the meetings were in headquarters, but today the meeting was at the football stadium itself, just before the match that afternoon. The prospect of sitting in one of the warm hospitality suites would make a welcome change from my regular season ticket seat in the West Stand.
The only fingerprints are Eddie Westford's and his sister's.
How do you know that?
He's dead. Taking his fingerprints is routine.
Don't be funny, Alvin. I meant his sister.
She's got a conviction for shoplifting. A quick check against the police national computer gave us the details.
It certainly meant Janet Westford had been rummaging round her brother's bag, and that her denials about being innocent seemed pretty worthless, too. I turned to leave.
We've finished with the laptop already, and you might be interested in looking at all the holiday snapshots. There's over 700 photographs of your man Westford enjoying the sun.
What?
Beach holiday, I guess. He's with his young kid most of the time.
I reached down for the laptop.
And we tested the cash you found in the bag. There was over £2,000 and a few €100. We ran a handheld detector over some of the notes.
She paused, an irritating affectation designed to attract my attention.
It came up with a positive reading for various drugs.
Now that does change things.
I thought you might be interested.
I'll need a full analysis.
Of course.
By Monday, Alvin.
You must be joking, Marco.
Murder isn't a laughing matter, Alvin. You should know that. At least I felt I had had the last word as I hurried back to the incident room. This laptop is full of Westford's holiday snaps, I said to Boyd. He gave me a puzzled look. I sat down by him and opened the laptop, navigating towards the My Pictures folder. We spent half an hour skimming through the contents. There were images of plates of food, smiling faces raising their glasses to the camera, Westford with a young boy, and another family with a youngster. We have any details about his friends?
I thought he was a bit of a loner.
You had better speak to his mates at work again. Find out who went on holiday with him. On Monday, we'll go back and talk to his ex-wife again. And this afternoon, check out his bank accounts. If he went on holiday, then he must have spent money. Westford had a pile of cash, and evidence that he'd spent a lot more on holidays. We had to find out where he'd gone on holiday, and more importantly, discover how someone like Westford could pay for it. Saturday, 1:30 p.m. Bring me up to date. Superintendent Cornock strode over to the car, waiting for us outside Queen Street. Eddie Westford's sister has been in this morning. He had given her a bag to keep for him. She denied knowing anything about the contents, but her fingerprints were all over the laptop inside. The driver started the engine as soon as we were sitting inside and sped away towards the Cardiff City Stadium. And there was over £2,000 in cash. Cornock kept staring straight ahead, and Alvin established there were significant traces of drugs on the money. Cornock glanced in my direction. So, is the murder drugs-related? We don't know yet, but there is some suggestion that Westford was a person of interest in an inquiry Dave Hobbs is leading. So, you're making progress. It sounds as though his death was a drug-related feud. These men who push drugs on the street will stop at nothing. Cornock managed a dismissive tone. It might be best if you turned your investigation over to Hobbs. The glance this time was a little more intense, and his tone nuanced. He knew the last thing I'd want would be to see Dave Hobbs take over my inquiry. There's still a lot to do. I need to speak to his former wife again, and we haven't completed our inquiries with his workmates. And the uniform lads have dozens of statements to process from the supporters at the ground the night Westwood was killed. It was the best I could do in the circumstances, and I felt quite pleased with myself that it resulted in a grudging acknowledgement from Cornock. Just focus on the drug angle for the time being. The driver deposited us outside the stadium. Cornock fastened his coat, adjusted his cap, and adopted his purposeful senior management walk as he headed for the main entrance. The reception we were attending was scheduled to start at 2:30, allowing plenty of time for canapes and Prosecco before kick-off. We took the lift to the 5th floor, where we were met by staff with broad smiles who ushered us down the corridor towards various hospitality suites. Cornock paused outside a door that was clearly marked Cardiff City Forum before he pushed it open and strode in. Once Cornock had fussed around introducing me to the various civilian staff, he started on the members of the forum. This is Michael Haddock, he said under his breath, as he walked up to a tall man with a double-breasted suit. Haddock had deep brown eyes and thick eyebrows that gave him a theatrical appearance. Superintendent Cornock, how nice to see you, Haddock boomed, thrusting out a hand. Cornock turned to me. This is Detective Inspector Marco. Haddock gave me a puzzled look, as though he had no idea why I should be there. I noticed that he wore a double-breasted waistcoat, too. Takes all sorts, I supposed. Haddock quickly excused himself and wandered off to speak to 2 other men in dark suits and a younger man in an expensive suit. That's Haddock's son, Jason. Cornock gave me a discreet nod towards the group. He had a reputation for being wild in his youth, mixed with the wrong crowd. I nodded. What does Haddock do? He's got this bioscience company, cutting-edge stuff, apparently, and it takes him all over the world. He was in Nigeria last month, in South Africa the month before. It's that sort of business that puts Cardiff on the map. It's very important that we network and develop these sorts of contacts in the community. He took another large sip of his wine. It's so easy to become divorced from everyday life. I preferred my own everyday life to the rarefied atmosphere that Cornock seemed to favour. Cornock pointed out one of the chaplains from the prison, a tall woman with flat shoes and loosely brushed hair with a centre parting that fell to her shoulders. She wore no makeup, and the red blotches on her face gave her an unhealthy appearance. Next to her was a representative of Cardiff City Football Club and various probation officers and social workers. Cornock nodded at a tall man who had a shaved head and the thick ears common among rugby players. "That's Gregory Clayton." The tone of his voice suggested I should know who he was talking about. I stared over at Clayton, but I'd never seen him before. Then I remembered sitting in Westford's flat and reading the tenancy agreement. Clayton Properties. What? Does he own Clayton Properties? Yes, and he runs the charity in the Bay, he whispered. The one that helps homeless people. He also runs courses in his computer business to rehabilitate people. All-round good guy. A woman with long hair and striking red lipstick came up to Clayton. That's Deborah, his wife, Cornock added in hushed tones. Her father's a surgeon, took out my appendix. She had long auburn hair that glistened healthily. The pillar-box red lipstick only made her look younger than her husband, 10 years at least. A probation officer I knew from court and a social worker who giggled as she introduced herself as Jill joined us as we gazed out over the immaculately prepared grass of the stadium. Both women confessed to knowing nothing about football and clearly had no head for alcohol. Another half a dozen strangers milled around, wine glasses in hand, occasionally nibbling on some food. I guessed that the forum made little meaningful contribution to fighting crime, but they were all well-intentioned. "How long will the game last?" Jill slurred. I leant over to the table and replenished my plate, hoping nobody would notice how many vol au vents I'd eaten. Cornock joined me and poured himself a generous measure of wine. "You looking forward to the game, John?" "Of course. It makes a change not to sit in the stadium." My season ticket was safely tucked away in the drawer of my bedroom cupboard. Some men went to the pub and got pissed on a Saturday night, but I was well past that stage now. While the other guests downed glasses of Prosecco, I contented myself with a glass of orange juice, which was a thin, acidic variety. One of the advantages of being permanently sober was that my taste buds could appreciate orange juice once again. Once Jackie had left me after a drunken evening, my first visit to an Alcoholics Anonymous meeting had been painful. It had never occurred to me that I was an alcoholic until my cousin Jeremy made a snide comment at a family party that stunned me into silence. "Everyone knows you're an alky, John. Pissed in your sleep recently?" I'd probably deserved the comment, but it didn't stop me wanting to take him outside to rearrange his expensive teeth. I stared over at Clayton again, wondering if there was a connection between him and Westford, or whether it was just a coincidence that he leased the victim his flat. "Michael Haddock has been very generous with his support for some of the contracts Gregory Clayton runs in supporting people back to work," Cornock continued. It all sounded too good to be true. The level of noise from the stadium increased to the point where it drew our attention. I settled into my seat, brushing pastry crumbs off my lap before finishing my orange juice. At half-time, I excused myself, and while, despite the spread on offer, still harbouring cravings for my regular chicken pie, I went outside for a smoke. I joined Haddock, who was smoking a cigarette with a strong, pungent smell, probably from the Middle East. "I've tried to give up," Haddock said. I nodded in agreed helplessness against our mutual addiction. We exchanged some small talk and then returned to the hospitality suite. As the players ran onto the field, I thought about Eddie Westford. Had he watched the midweek game? He must have met somebody who had a reason to be at the ground, and reason enough to kill him. After the match finished, Haddock introduced new members of the forum, hoping that we would all be able to attend the next formal meeting. He even outlined the agenda, which did nothing to persuade me that I should diarise the meeting. "I hope you found that constructive," Cornock said as we drove back to Queen Street. "Of course, Haddock is a useful contact for you." Contact? There must have been more than the correct quotient of cynicism in my voice, because Cornock glared at me. "Yes, John. Someone in the community that can help in building bridges and develop policing in the modern world." He was sounding like a robot, and I wondered if it was a natural consequence of promotion. Cornock pulled the car into the entrance of Queen Street Police Station. and we both walked over to the main entrance where he punched in a security number. He held the door open and paused, giving me an intense look. "Keep me posted, John." He strode into the building, leaving me with the feeling that apart from watching Cardiff playing at home, my introduction to the Forum had been a waste of time. Time that I should have been spending on the Westford inquiry. Even so, the connection to Clayton intrigued me, another item for my to-do list. Chapter 6, Monday, 9:30 a.m. After reading the analysis of Cardiff's defeat in the sports section of the morning newspaper, I threw it onto the back seat of the car. There was no escaping the conclusion that the team needed a new striker, and unless they found one in the next transfer window, Cardiff City faced another season with promotion dreams dashed. "Enjoyed the game, sir?" Boyd said. I thought about the celebrations on the field from the Rotherham players after the third goal. It filled me with despair. Rotherham had been in the lowest division 2 years previously, and Cardiff had been in the Premiership the previous season. Terrible result. "It's only football, boss." I slowly turned my head towards Boyd. Did he really mean that? Boyd slowed by a junction, the pulsing sound of the indicator filling the cabin. The traffic cleared, and he steered the car down the side streets of Adamstown towards Kylie Westford's terraced home. He parked, and we marched over to the house. Rap music vibrated from inside, and I doubted that even repeated pressing of the doorbell would draw Kylie's attention. Boyd hammered on a window as I did the same on the front door. The music stopped abruptly. The door opened a few centimetres, and Kylie peered at me, wearing a thin t-shirt that finished too far up her thighs. "What do you want?" "We need to speak to you." "Give me a minute." She pushed the door closed, returning moments later, her modesty restored with a dressing gown that reached to her ankles but barely around her middle. "What time is it?" She rubbed her palms over both eyes. "We need to speak to you about Eddie." "What? Again?" She flopped onto a large chair. Boyd pushed various celebrity magazines to one side and made a place for us to sit on a sofa. "You didn't tell us Eddie had been on various holidays with Hartley." "What's that got to do with anything?" "Where did they go?" "Can't remember." I paused and sat back thinking I didn't have time to waste. Perhaps your memory might be better if we spoke to you in one of the interview rooms at Queen Street. "He went to Spain. In the last 2 years he went 3 times. "Where did he get the money to pay for the holidays?" She raised her voice. "How would I know? He didn't pay for any holidays when we were married. All I know is he bought lots of kit for Hartley recently, and he kept blagging me to go out with him." "Did he want to reconcile?" She frowned. "Get back together with you?" "Dunno." The floorboards squeaked upstairs, and then a door closed. "Is that Hartley?" I asked. "He's off school today. It's training day for the teachers." "Can I talk to him?" She shrugged again before sliding off the sofa and flouncing over to the door towards the rear of the house. She bellowed up the stairs. Moments later, I heard the sound of footsteps descending, and a young boy entered the living room, rubbing sleep from red-tinged eyes. Even 10-year-old boys could cry when their dad died. He sat down next to his mother, who draped an arm over his shoulder. I lowered my voice, trying to recall the techniques about interviewing young children. "My name is John. I'm very sorry about your dad. I'm looking for the person responsible." Hartley's gaze darted around the room. "We found some photographs on a laptop your dad owned. They were taken when you were on holiday in Spain. Do you remember that holiday?" He nodded. "We went swimming." "Was your dad a good swimmer?" Another nod before he glanced at his mother. "Did you go with your father to watch the Bluebirds playing? He was a big fan, wasn't he?" Hartley straightened his position. "We went to the home games quite often. None of the other boys at school had a dad with a season ticket, and none of them had an MPT. MPT? Kylie offered an explanation. It's short for male ponytail. Hartley thought it was really cool that Eddie had such long hair. Can you tell me who was with you when you went on holiday to Spain? I nodded at Boyd, who took notes as Hartley gave us names of people who had holidayed with them. Did you stay over with your dad at his flat? Yeah, sometimes. We'd watch old Cardiff City matches and maybe get a takeaway. Mostly it was pizza, but sometimes he wanted fish and chips. Kylie added with a grin. Hartley doesn't like fish and chips. Did you ever meet any of your dad's friends? The boy shrugged again.
Sometimes he talked to people in the stadium after the game.
Did you hear what they talked about? He shook his head quickly. And what about other times?
You mean outside the ground?
Yes, or any time. Hartley pushed himself nearer to his mother. I glanced over at Boyd, who stopped making notes and gave me a troubled frown. Did you see anything, Hartley? He played with the fingers of both hands.
There were 2 men who argued with him.
When was that?
Outside the stadium last week. He was standing in a queue for a burger. Dad went over to talk to one of them.
Tell me what happened. Although my voice was soft, my pulse thumped in my neck. Hartley paused.
One of them just kept jabbing a finger at Dad.
Were they arguing?
Suppose so. I didn't like them.
Can you describe them? He shook his head.
One of them had long hair, like Dad, and the other looked like a bird had pooed on his head.
I need you to describe both men very carefully, Hartley. I hoped that the descriptions might match the men who had run away from Westford's flat. I pressed him for more details, but he had only seen the man with long hair from behind, and he gave me a vague description of the second man. What happened after they spoke to your dad?
They walked over to the car. Dad came back to where I was standing.
It would be a long shot to hope that Hartley might have seen the registration number. Do you remember the car?
It was a Jaguar XK Type R.
Hartley's precision stunned me into silence. How can you be certain? Kylie interrupted.
He's mad about cars. He can tell you everything about sports cars. That's why Eddie sent them photographs. Why don't you show John your room?
Hartley smiled for the first time, then left his mother's side. I followed him upstairs, Boyd trailing behind me. Every square inch of Hartley's bedroom was covered with posters from various car manufacturers advertising their latest models. He pointed to each one, giving us a summary of the car's performance. Hartley was particularly well informed about the Jaguar XK sports coupes, and left me in no doubt the man Westford had argued with owned one. I know it might be difficult for you to remember, but when did you see this car exactly? Can you remember the game you were watching?
It was the game against Fulham last week. The Bluebirds won 3-1.
Returning downstairs, I thanked Kylie, and as soon as we left, I dipped a hand into my jacket pocket and found my mobile. Seconds later, I requisitioned intelligence on every owner of a Jaguar XK Type R. Monday, 2 p.m. The number of 6 Series BMWs sold in the United Kingdom with Mediterranean blue paint and ivory white leather upholstery was much greater than I'd expected. It amazed me that people could afford to buy one of these vehicles and accept the eye-watering depreciation in the first year. I scanned the list, thinking there must be some way we could thin out the possible candidates. 15 of the vehicles had been sold through various dealerships in London, another 5 in Manchester, the same number in Leeds, and the rest through various dealers in other parts of the UK. I bellowed at Boyd, who trundled into my office chewing his way through an apple. He sat down, and I explained to him we needed to put names, addresses, and contact details against each individual vehicle. I allocated the various London dealerships to Boyd, and we set about the task in hand. All of the dealers in Manchester struck a sceptical defensive tone, using data protection as an excuse. After cajoling, each requested formal confirmation, and I tapped out one email after another, hoping I wouldn't need to resort to a formal request from Superintendent Cornock to contact them. His words that I should concentrate on the drug-dealing angle seemed to get louder during the afternoon. An hour passed, and having spoken to only 4 dealerships, a sense that I had set myself an unrealistic task dominated my thoughts. In half an hour, I had taken 3 telephone calls from concerned owners in the northwest of England. All were women who confirmed that their 6 Series BMW coupe was safely locked up in the garage. Boyd had been luckier. 7 of the London-based owners had confirmed they still had possession of their pride and joy. I slurped a mouthful of hot coffee and then chewed my way through a donut from the bag of pastries that Boyd had dumped on my desk. "Is this a waste of time, boss?" "I hope not." I dabbed a tissue to the corner of my mouth. The inbox displayed on my computer monitor told me an email had arrived, and I clicked it open and read the response. My heart sank. "Bad news," Boyd said, a worried look on his face. "Jaguar have just confirmed they made 150 XK Type Rs. He sat back and blew out a lungful of breath before saying what was on my mind. This could take days. I got back to the task in hand and started on the deal ships from Leeds. The radiator behind me made an odd gurgling sound, as though it was straining to keep up with the demands of heating the room all day. I spoke to startled receptionists, inquisitive salesmen, and a couple of nonchalant managing directors. But by the end of the afternoon, I was no further forward. 10 more owners had been identified or had called me. 10 cars accounted for. I worked my way north until I reached a dealership in Northumberland. The receptionist spoke with a thick Geordie accent. She put me through to a boss, who introduced herself as Angela Makepeace. I am interested in the possible theft of a 6 Series coupe, Mediterranean blue, ivory white leather upholstery. That'll be Jim Holland. Relief washed over me that we might have made progress. I stood up, covered the handset and yelled over at Boyd. What do you know about the theft? It was last April. He was away somewhere for the weekend, and the thieves had managed to steal his keys from him. That's the only explanation. He complained bitterly about the way the police handled the complaint. He was cut up. His wife adored the car. Can you give me his contact details? I waited. Boyd stood by the door, and I waved him into my office. I heard a voice dictating a number which I scribbled into a notepad before thanking Angela Makepeace profusely. This is it. A similar car was stolen in Northumberland. Northumberland? Why would Ellie Westford have gone to Northumberland? I punched into my handset the number Makepeace had given me. Another Geordie voice answered soon enough. Holland? My name is Detective Inspector John Marco, Wales Police Service. I was given your contact details by Angela Makepeace. I understand your 6 Series BMW coupe was stolen earlier this year. Have you found it? Because it's taken me months to get replacement organised. No luck, sir, I'm afraid. But could you tell me some details about the theft of your vehicle? 10 minutes later, I had the full details of Holland's trip to Birmingham. One of his oldest friends had invited him to watch Birmingham City play Cardiff in the Premiership from his corporate box. Holland gave me an explanation of how successful his friend had been in business. The BMW had been parked in a VIP section, and Holland was convinced a pickpocket had been at work, because when he returned to the car park, he couldn't find his keys, and the vehicle had disappeared. There's no chance anyone could have broken into a BMW in the middle of a car park and stolen it without keys. It's just not bloody possible. Can you tell me the name of the officer dealing with your complaint? Sergeant Ramsden, in the West Midlands Constabulary, and a fat lot of good he was. Anyway, what's all this about? It's part of an ongoing investigation. If you find my car, call me straight away. Where are you again? Cardiff. Nice place. Shame Cardiff City went down straight away after the year in the Premiership. I finished the call and sat down, my excitement easing. It was stolen in Birmingham. I stood up, abruptly, and marched through into the incident room. I stared at Westford's face on the board. Have we got a map? My mind was racing, possibilities developing. Map of where, boss? Boyd sounded confused. England and Wales. Forget it. Let's use Google. I pulled up a chair in front of Boyd's desk. As he clicked his mouse, I scoured my memory and jotted down the names of various towns and cities. The screen filled with the map of England and Wales before I'd finished. This is a list of all the Premiership sides that Cardiff played last season. We ran through each, identifying their proximity to motorways and guessing the driving time from Cardiff. Every Premiership match will have visiting spectators with expensive cars coming to be flattered by businessmen with corporate boxes. Cornock's words about the importance of building contacts as we ate minuscule portions of food in the hospitality suite reverberated in my mind. It would be rich pickings, and we know Westford has been throwing money around. Boyd nodded. There's no record from his bank account of him paying for a holiday or converting money to euros. And then I remembered the box of papers I'd taken from Westford's flat. I pushed back the chair and marched back to my room where I tipped the contents onto my desk. Boyd followed behind me, and when I picked up several scraps of paper, he gave me a puzzled look. I thrust the petrol receipts from the M5 motorway towards Boyd. These will tell us where Westford has been. Now we had a real focus to this inquiry, even if it wasn't what Cornock envisaged. Chapter 7. Tuesday, 10 a.m. By 10 p.m. the previous evening, I had left messages with all the relevant police forces covering the towns and cities with football clubs in the Premiership at the same time as Cardiff. I had given the request for information about thefts of high-end motor vehicles an urgent priority. I knew none of the forces had dedicated teams dealing with car thefts, and it worried me that I could be waiting a long time for replies. I reached for my telephone and tapped in the number of Sergeant Ramsden. His absence on leave the day before had thwarted my attempts to make progress. Pat Ramsden? Detective Inspector Marco, Wales Police Service. I'm interested in your investigation into a stolen BMW owned by Jim Holland. He groaned. Jim Holland has made a right nuisance of himself. The car was used by his wife every day. You don't give car theft a big priority? What force does these days? Everything is covered by insurance. The owners get all their money back. The only people who lose out are the insurance companies. And I don't hear anybody putting them at the top of the list of victims of crime. We follow all the usual protocols. We circulate the details of the car's registration details and plates. Did you have a record of it on CCTV? Probably. But we didn't commit hundreds of man-hours into looking at CCTV coverage from all around the city. It's not a major problem anymore. Cars are becoming more secure. Unless you've got the keys or some fancy electronic gizmo to get a car started, thieves are only interested in old knackered-out cars. Do you keep a central record of all car crime? Not any longer. Any intelligence about an organised crime group goes to our regional organised crime group team. I knew exactly what he meant. Southern Division of the Wales Police Service had recently formed a dedicated OCG team, targeting the highly organised, highly efficient and highly mobile gangs. I'll give you the name of a sergeant in the Thames Valley Police who knows more about car thefts than I do. Give me a minute. I could hear the clicking of a mouse and papers shuffling. Ramsden gave me the details and wished me luck. I had a feeling I would need it. Boyd stuck his head round my door and gesticulated with his hand an offer to make coffee. I nodded, and minutes later he reappeared with 2 mugs. He plonked mine on the desk and then himself on a chair. I finished all those BMW dealers. The last thing I wanted to hear was confirmation that a second identical car had been stolen. Good news? It looks like Holland is the only one who lost that sort of 6 Series. I was looking at the price this morning. Do you know how much they cost? More than I earn in a year. Boyd chortled. Both of us, boss. I waved Boyd away and picked up the telephone again. Before I could dial, I noticed an email from Superintendent Cornock telling me he had organised a liaison meeting with Dave Hobbs. I could see the investigation slipping through my fingers. Hobbs would wear that smirk he had polished to a nauseating degree, and unless I had something new to tell Cornock, there would be nothing I could do about it. And his clear instruction not to pursue my present line of inquiry only tightened the knot of worry in my stomach. It took an hour to track down Sergeant Beacon in the Thames Valley Police. He sounded tired. There are only 4 of us, I heard a sigh down the telephone line. I keep telling my superiors I need more resources. I got 3 officers and 1 civilian. I get calls from all over the country. And, not to be rude, Inspector, but car crime isn't a priority. I could hear the irritation in my own voice as I repeated the details. He listened without interrupting me. It sounds very similar to a lot of these offences. Luxury cars are stolen to order. They'll be into containers within an hour of being stolen, then trucked to a port and onto a ship for Australia or West Africa. Because these luxury cars are very hard to break into, the gangs usually steal the car keys. I heard of one case where the keys of an Aston Martin were stolen in broad daylight from a hallway table, while the owner was talking to 2 fake community police officers. I thanked Beacon and wondered how I would explain to Cornock that the image of Eddie Westford sitting in 3 luxury cars justified the expenditure of resources. Boyd interrupted my musings. I've checked out the date of that motorway receipt. I wasn't paying attention. The receipt you found in Westford's flat? I nodded, waving him into my office. Westford was travelling south on the M5 motorway. It was the day Cardiff were playing in Birmingham. So, he didn't take the regular supporters coach back to Cardiff. Did you check the other receipts? Boyd shook his head. I drew a blank there, boss. None of the receipts are for motorway services, and none of them coincide with days when Cardiff were playing. I felt as though we were taking one small step forward, and several more larger ones backwards. Boyd fiddled with a sheaf of papers on his lap. He looked over at me. I could sense the reluctance to share bad news. There's more. Go on. We've had the details of owners of Jaguar XK Type R coupes. By the way Boyd was dragging out sharing this information with me, I realised it wasn't good news. I sat back in my chair. "You won't believe this, boss." Not much surprised me any longer. Mrs. Deborah Clayton owns one. Tuesday, 8:30 p.m. Terry emptied his pint of brains in one hit, put the glass down and dragged the back of his hand across his mouth before sharing a satisfied grin. "I hadn't realised the Soul Crew are such a bunch of fucking knobheads." I took a sip of my orange juice. The revelation earlier linking Westford to Clayton had been dominating my mind. It struck me now that pursuing the Soul Crew was simply giving Terry an excuse to get drunk with his old mates. "Have you got anything constructive you can tell me?" Terry glanced around the pub. It was one of our regular haunts, hidden away down a side street in Whitchurch. We sat in a small room at the back, well away from the prying eyes of the regulars watching the football on television. "I did as you asked, Marco. I met up with some of my old mates last Friday night. We went on a massive bender." There was warmth and enjoyment in Terry's recollection, as though he were savouring an exquisite meal at an expensive restaurant. "I was shit-faced by the end." I leant over towards Terry. "Get on with it." "I was just like Jason Bourne, all secret agent type stuff, keeping my eye out for some of the ringleaders." He paused and stared at me. "The Soul Crew isn't about the football anymore." He hesitated again, judging my reaction. Clearly disappointed I hadn't risen to the bait and asked for full details, he continued. "On Friday, I was in a pub with some of the old Soul Crew lads. There were a couple of younger lads there who'd been on the piss all day, and they were really mouthing off. One of them kept bragging about the Astons and Ferraris he was driving down the motorway. He was going on about it, and it all sounded dodgy, and he was a young kid, and no way was what he was doing legal. One of his mates clocked me and then told him to shut up." My mind was racing ahead now. How conceivable was it that the Soul Crew were involved in the theft of luxury cars? "And then, on Saturday, I was in the same pub and I got talking to my mates about the same young lads. It was like they'd got the plague. They just fucking glanced at each other and said nothing and told me it was none of my fucking business. It really got me spooked. So I got back to the drinking. You won't believe the stuff they get involved with." I raised an eyebrow. He finished the pint and pushed the empty glass over towards me. I trudged over to the small bar area and ordered 2 more drinks. By the time I got back to my table, Terry had relaxed. "And today, I heard the young kid was in Spain." "Holiday?" "You must be fucking joking. He'd been shipped out to work in a bar, and the first night he was set on by some local youths, maybe even Swansea supporters." Terry managed the barest of smiles. "The shit was well and truly kicked out of him, and everyone that has anything to do with the Soul Crew is now scared witless." I wondered what was happening in the background, and it troubled me that Terry looked frightened. All I had to do was fathom out who was involved. Chapter 8. Wednesday, 10:30 a.m. A preliminary financial report into Gregory Clayton made interesting reading. Apart from the investment portfolio of tenanted properties he owned, his wife had been developing substantial financial assets herself. Drug dealers, certainly the clever ones, made certain their wives accumulated assets through legitimate businesses. A laundrette, a Chinese takeaway, and a string of properties let out to the ever-increasing student population of Cardiff would enable Mrs. Clayton to launder drug money easily enough. Envy had probably got the better of her, as she eyed some of her neighbours in Rada, a prosperous suburb of the city, with their legitimate Audis and Mercedes. And she had gone one better with her silver Jaguar. I should have reported Mrs. Clayton's involvement to Detective Inspector Dave Hobbs, in writing, using the sort of formal language he enjoyed, but I wasn't ready to give the murder inquiry to him that easily, and if the roles had been reversed, his mind would have been working overtime to plot how he could protect his own fiefdom. I sauntered into the incident room where Boyd sat staring at his computer monitor. He glanced up as I walked towards the board. A photograph of Gregory Clayton and his wife had been pinned underneath Westford's. The paucity of evidence meant that soon enough I would suffer Dave Hobbs's condescension. The mere thought made my skin crawl. If Clayton is dealing drugs, and Westford is involved, then why is he driving a stolen car down the motorway? I looked over at Boyd. He screwed his lips into a thoughtful expression.
Maybe it was unconnected with Clayton's drug dealing? I turned back to look at Westford. There was a naive streak to the face. Maybe he had been a low-level courier for Clayton. It certainly explained the regular Spanish holidays and trips for his son. Perhaps he had got greedy, demanded a bigger slice of the cake. It didn't fit the pattern somehow. Drug dealers demand loyalty, and Westford didn't strike me as the sort of person to take risks. He would have been content with his lot in life. My gaze drifted down to the 3 photographs of Westford in luxury cars smiling broadly to the camera. Dave Hobbs would have a facile reply, explaining away the inconsistencies with a paragraph of management speak. The door from the stairwell creaked open, and Alvine Dix marched in. "Good morning, Alvine. John?" She nodded, before giving Boyd a brief twitch of her lips. "Making progress?" I noticed the file of papers Alvine clutched in her right hand, and I guessed this wasn't a social call. She pulled up a chair and sat down, glancing over at the board. "It was quite a brutal murder. Very clinical, almost scientific. Did you read the pathologist's report?" The question was intended to catch me out. Alvine would know that, however distasteful, I would have read the pathologist's report several times. I decided not to indulge her. She couldn't resist the invitation to continue. "The pathologist thinks the wound could have been caused by a medical instrument." "I know." "So, I thought you might be interested in the result of the forensics from the crime scene." She tossed the file of papers onto the nearest table. "I've attached a copy of an analysis of some of the rubbish Westford had accumulated in his hair." She nodded towards the picture on the board. "I wonder what sort of shampoo he used." Boyd and I glanced at each other before giving Alvine a surprised look. I bought the cheapest green-coloured guns from the local supermarket in a bottle that would stand upright in a little container I had in the corner of my shower. "He probably picked up all sorts of rubbish when he was lying on the ground. You might be interested in the cigarette butt we found." "Okay, Alvine, get to the point." She was shredding my patience now. "It was from one of those fancy Turkish varieties. It hadn't been smoked right to the butt, so it was easy to match the brands. They've got a distinctive aroma, haven't they?" Boyd added. Alvine stood up, making to leave. "It's probably the sort of cigarette a drug dealer would smoke." There was only one person I knew who smoked Turkish cigarettes, and as far as I knew, he wasn't a drug dealer. Wednesday, 3 p.m. Dave Hobbs sat across from me at the polished table in the conference room on the 2nd floor at Queen Street. He'd recently visited the barber, judging by the neatness of his hair. A plain navy tie was knotted carefully into the semi-cutaway collar of his white shirt. Our relationship had long dispensed with the formality of a handshake. "Dave?" He dipped his head and his lips quivered. Next to him sat a man with a completely shaven head that glistened in the artificial light. His shoulders protruded upwards as though someone had connected him to one of those machines in a garage forecourt that inflates tires. "Do you know Sergeant Watkins?" Hobbs turned to his colleague. Common courtesy propelled me to reach over a hand, and then I wished I hadn't, as I felt the blood being squeezed out by a crushing handshake. Before we could exchange small talk, Superintendent Cornock swept into the room and plonked his cap on the table. It made a change to see him in full uniform. "I've got a meeting with the Assistant Chief Constable in half an hour. So, we need to make this snappy." He sat down, placing one hand over another before looking over in my direction. "The current investigation led by Inspector Marco into the death of Eddie Westford has thrown up a potential connection to Gregory Clayton. As we know, Mr. Clayton is well connected. John, what evidence is there linking Westford to Clayton?" Hobbs and Watkins simultaneously turned to look at me, willing me to foul up. "Westford was one of Clayton's tenants. We believe that Westford argued with Clayton after a recent Cardiff City home game." "For goodness sake, John, that is not taking you very far," Cornock said. "Clayton and his wife have also accumulated a lot of wealth recently." I noticed Hobbs nodding slowly. "The speed at which he has accumulated properties is certainly of interest." His encouragement surprised me, so I continued. "And our preliminary work suggests Mrs. Clayton has businesses that could facilitate money laundering." Hobbs nodded again. I could even see my view of him changing if this continued. I stared at Hobbs.
Are there any other persons of interest in your inquiry? Cornock butted in before he could reply. We have to identify the best use of resources. I can't have two detective inspectors investigating the same potential suspect. John, do you have any direct eyewitness evidence that Westford and Clayton knew each other personally or saw them arguing? No. Any forensics? The pathologists think the murder weapon might be a scientific knife. Hobbs now. What, like a scalpel? I nodded, and the pathologist found the remains of Turkish cigarettes in Westford's hair. Hobbs and Watkins gave me a puzzled look. Westford had very long hair. They nodded their understanding. Are you suggesting we look for people who smoke Turkish cigarettes in Cardiff? Cornock didn't hide the incredulity in his voice. I only know one person who smokes Turkish cigarettes. Michael Haddock. Cornock guffawed. Have you taken leave of your senses? I hope you're not suggesting Haddock is our killer. He's a member of the Cardiff City Task Force Forum, and he supports numerous charities for Christ's sake. A smirk was developing all over Hobbs's face. I knew the link to Haddock was tenuous, so I decided on another approach. I'm still exercised about the connection between Westford and stolen cars. In particular, sir, we know he was driving on the motorway on the day a luxury 6 Series BMW was stolen in Birmingham. You can be as exercised as you want. It's still not giving us any evidence. I think it would be more sensible if your investigation— He looked over at me and raised his eyebrows. Were allocated to Inspector Hobbs and his team. I leant over the table. I got some good intelligence sources on the Cardiff City Soul crew, and I'm certain I can make progress. I ran out of steam. It all sounded unconvincing. A few days, until the beginning of next week. I stared at Cornock, willing him to give me those extra few days. I could see his mind working. I looked over at Hobbs. He was squinting over at Cornock, and I can imagine him playing an alien in a film with telepathic powers. Abruptly, Cornock stood up, scooping up his cap. Monday, at the latest. You might make some progress this weekend. He gave me the barest of smiles, and left. Chapter 9. Thursday, 10:30 a.m. We pulled up outside Westwood's flat, and I looked up at the property. Boyd had already warned me that the tenant, a Mrs. Webster, an elderly woman, had kept him talking for half an hour on the telephone when he arranged to call. As she had the ground floor apartment, he judged she might be the best tenant for us to talk to about Westford. Mrs. Webster insisted on making tea despite our feeble objections. I could see the rest of the morning disappearing in an interview that should have taken no more than half an hour. She returned from the kitchen carrying a tray with 3 steaming mugs. How well did you know Eddie Westford? I said, as she pushed a bowl of sugar lumps towards my tea. No, thanks, I'm watching my waistline. Boyd made a snorting sound, and then helped himself to 3 lumps. There were a lot of funny goings-on. What do you mean? She sat back in a chair and gave us more detail about Westford's nocturnal visitors. I glanced around the flat, and seeing no graduation photographs of grandchildren or family scenes, I guessed the activities of the tenants in the block were the sole interest in Mrs. Webster's life. Almost an hour flew past, as she gave us details of Westford's life, how she always made a point of talking to Hartley when he visited, and how she didn't like the look of some of the druggies that visited. Eventually, I cut across her. Do you know Mr. Clayton? She curled up her lips. I've seen him once or twice. Quite a rude man. His wife is lovely. I make her Welsh cakes. How often does she visit? I made my voice sound casual. Quite a few times. She took another sip of her tea. I think one time she actually called to see Mr. Westford. We stayed a little longer than I had intended, teasing more detail from her about the visits by Mr. and Mrs. Clayton. Loneliness and her make-believe world made seeing the truth difficult. After thanking her, we left, and glancing back at the front window, saw her wave from the side of the net curtain. Probably the most excitement she's had all week, Boyd said as we reached the car. I stood by the car to finish my second cigarette of the morning. Let's see what the Claytons have to say. I thought Inspector Hobbs's team was investigating them. I ground the butt onto the pavement. I'm sure he won't mind. Thursday, 2 p.m. A large sign hung outside the old chapel listing the various activities that took place inside. A yoga class, numerous educational courses, and the computer training Gregory Clayton's company offered. And there was a cafe offering all-day breakfasts. Boyd and I followed the sign to the first floor. A fatty bacon smell hung in the air. At the end of a corridor, a sign was fixed to the door, China Grove Training. I pushed it open, and Boyd followed me through. A young woman with large red-framed glasses looked up from her desk and gave us a blank stare. "Can I help?" It didn't sound as though she had any interest in doing so. Flashing our warrant cards got her attention, and she picked up the telephone handset and punched in a number. The place looked like any other office, humming computers, pot plants on cluttered desks, and whiteboards on the wall with scribbled notices. China Grove Training had various contracts with government agencies, and its website boasted how many unemployed people it had helped into employment by improving their skills and education. It all sounded too good to be true. It was the sort of success story that made me suspicious. Clayton strode through the office towards us and reached out a hand. "Inspector Marco! I didn't expect to see you again so soon." He gave me a politician's smile and shook my hand a fraction too energetically. I introduced Boyd, and we followed Clayton into his office. "I expect this visit is about Eddie Westford." The reference to Westford unnerved me. I sat down and used another of his smiles. It told me he enjoyed being in control. I could see why politicians might like him. His forehead was a fraction too high and his cheekbones a little too wide, which gave his face a disjointed appearance the more you looked at it. He was killed on Tuesday evening near the Cardiff City Stadium. "I know. I saw the details in the paper." "How well did you know him?" Before he could reply, Deborah Clayton joined him and sat by his side. She had wary eyes and a cold body language. "Inspector Marco was asking about Eddie Westford." "Who?" Her reply was a fraction too quick and well rehearsed. "He was one of our tenants." When he reminded her of the address, she feigned surprise. Of course. I remember." I turned to Clayton. "Did you ever meet him?" "I don't remember. We have a lot of tenants." Deborah added, "We do have an agent who looks after the properties." She crossed a long, slim leg over the other knee. I doubted that Welsh cakes made a regular appearance on her menu. "When did you last visit the property where Eddie Westford lived?" It was a question for both of them, but Deborah answered first. "Where is it again?" I repeated the address. "I don't honestly remember going there." For the sake of completeness, I looked at Gregory Clayton to answer the same question. "Sorry, Inspector. I can't remember." I paused, wondering why they had lied. "I need a list of all the other tenants in the block." "Of course. Do you have any suspects?" "It's still very early in the investigation." I nodded at Boyd, who had a cautious look on his face. We made to leave, and Clayton followed us out of his office and down to the front door. "I hope you catch the culprit," he said. "So do I." Boyd and I marched back to the car. "They were lying, boss." "I know. All we have to do is work out why." Chapter 10. Friday morning. I'd spent a miserable evening the night before trying to relax. We'd spent the rest of the day building a picture of Gregory Clayton, but the more Boyd and I had dug, the more we acknowledged to each other that by Monday the inquiry would be on Inspector Hobbs's desk. That morning, I'd woken early, and, deciding I needed a breath of sea air before work, I'd walked down to the bay, past the Millennium Centre, around the Norwegian church, and then back to my apartment. Justifiably pleased with my early morning stroll, I rewarded myself with a greasy bacon roll and a milky coffee before arriving at Queen Street. In the incident room, I stared at the image of Michael Haddock pinned to the board. Our brief smokers' cabal the previous Saturday came to mind, and I wondered if it really was one of his fancy Turkish cigarettes that had been caught in Westford's hair. There must be hundreds of people who smoked a similar type of cigarette, and I was worried that I was trying to create links where there were none. It was quite possibly just a coincidence, but it did still make me suspicious, so I spent the morning trawling the internet for details of Michael Haddock. His entry in LinkedIn took me over an hour to read, Despite using an online dictionary to help me understand the technical terms relating to his training and achievements, they meant nothing to me. Haddock's beaming face adorned several business-related pages in various newspapers, one of which suggested that if there was a Welsh Businessman of the Year award, he should win it. I spotted a brief article about the level of support one of his companies had received from the Welsh government. Then I found a YouTube clip of an open-shirted Haddock sauntering through his classic car collection while talking to a journalist as part of a television profile. I stared at the cars, and something made me pause the video. Haddock had his hands in the air. Behind him was a Porsche and a couple of small MG sports cars. Then I remembered that one of the sergeants I'd spoken to about car thefts had mentioned West Africa as a destination for stolen vehicles. I stared at Haddock again. He had connections to Nigeria, and, as I finished the video, my suspicions about Haddock heightened again. I shouted at Boyd. Initially, Boyd didn't share my enthusiasm for spending time looking in detail at Haddock, but mid-morning he suggested the accounts for Haddock's business be given the once-over by a colleague in the economic crime team. Boyd returned just before lunch. "Makes interesting reading, boss," Boyd said, slumping into one of the visitor chairs in my room. It made a welcome change to have anything that would stimulate a constructive discussion. "Not everything is as rosy as Haddock would have the public believe." I sat back in my chair. "Haddock's main company is massively in debt. He's had to restructure the borrowing a number of times. The last time, banks from Nigeria bailed him out." "What?" "Nothing wrong with that in itself. Nigeria was a former British colony, remember?" Boyd sounded very knowledgeable. "But my friend in economic crime thought it meant the level of risk involved was higher than the UK bank would take." "Is this helping us with Westford's murder?" Boyd just stared at me. An embarrassed silence oozed around us. Friday, 4 p.m. The late afternoon end-of-week malaise had descended on me and Boyd. We sat nursing mugs of coffee, each staring at the incident room board as we contemplated the inevitable conclusion to our inquiry. Detective Inspector Dave Hobbs would be taking over the whole case on Monday, and I wondered if it meant Cornock had some desk job lined up for us. Neither Boyd nor I moved when we heard the sound of the incident room door opening. We kept on staring at the board, oblivious to the impending visitation. "Good afternoon, Inspector." Every nerve in my body powered into life at the mere sound of Dave Hobbs's voice. The sing-song lilt sent my teeth on edge. My jaw tightened, and I hauled my feet off the desk, almost spilling my coffee in the process. "I was hoping we could agree a time for my team to take over the investigation." "My team." "I've got a time slot for Monday in the middle of our schedule." "Schedule?" I cleared my throat, glancing over at the incident room board, as though it might give me some inspiration. Westford was still grinning, Clayton and Haddock still pinned underneath, and I had no idea what to say. So, I did what I do best, make it up as I go along. "Oh, that's very kind of you, Dave. Detective Sergeant Pierce and myself were just discussing how best we could structure a meeting for your team to take over. We've been chasing down some loose ends yesterday and today. There could be some quite interesting new developments for your team to look at next week." Hobbs gave me an ingratiating smile. "Glad to hear it." I looked at Boyd, who gave me a nervous twitch. Then I smiled at Hobbs, my special lips tight together I hate you smile. And then he left. "What on earth did you—" Boyd said. But before I could reply, a message arrived on my mobile. Terry wanted to meet. Urgent. Friday, 6:30 p.m. Spidery burst blood vessels marched all over Terry's face, which had a pasty complexion. The speed at which he demolished his first pint of brains was undiminished. "You'll need to see me right, Marco." I squinted over at him. "I'll need enough money to cover my tracks." He reached down and took another long mouthful. Contemplating what Superintendent Cornock might make of my expenses claim was enough to make me ponder a vodka and tonic. "At the moment, you've given me nothing." "Don't be a prick." "You know how it works, Terry. I'm not going to pay for you to go on a bender without some results." He gave me a defiant glare. "I'll need at least 50 quid a week for 6 weeks.
That makes 300. I'll buy all my food. All they eat is shit burgers. He recoiled at the prospect. Look, the Bluebirds are playing Bristol City tomorrow. The implication in his tone was clear enough. So, what's happening? There's a score to be settled by some of the lads. They were talking about smashing up a couple of the pubs used by Bristol supporters. Names? He shrugged. Come on, Terry. That's down to you, Marco. I didn't get to hear the names, and even if I did, I wouldn't tell, because soon enough they work out someone was grassing them up. That's all. Terry finished the drink and wiggled the glass around noisily on the table. I got the message and walked over to the bar, returning with a pint for Terry and an orange juice. He had always been reliable with his information, and I had to hope now was no exception. I've been hard at it. I'd forgotten the crap these guys talk. It's all just mindless. So, I was looking for something out of the ordinary, something different. Terry was warming to this secret agent role. I overheard two guys. They were boasting about all these cars they've been driving. That's nothing new. Keep your shirt on, Marco. These guys are different. They're organised. Having a fight when you're pissed on Saturday night with an opposing football supporter is one thing. Quite enjoyed that when I was young. But planning this random destruction, I don't see the fucking point of it all. He paused to take a mouthful of beer. Have you got any names? Addresses? He grimaced and put the glass back on the table. You know the deal. 300 should see me clear. A lot of the Soul Crew are meeting up in Bristol tomorrow, and both men are going to be there. I stared at Terry. They've got something planned, I could tell. Terry stared back. I left to find a cash point. When I returned, Terry counted the money twice and named both men, describing them in detail and telling me he had no idea where either man lived. I rushed back to Queen Street. I had a trip to plan. Chapter 11. Saturday, 5:15 p.m. I stood alongside a minibus with the name of a football club in large letters down one side. I stamped my feet on the ground, hoping the movement would keep the cold at bay. Before leaving Cardiff, I'd found a pair of thick fleece gloves, but still my fingers felt cold, and banging them together had little effect. Boyd stood a few hundred yards away on the opposite side of the car park. A search the night before had given us the addresses of Paul Ferris and Malcolm Horne. Following their Ford Mondeo from Cardiff had not been a difficult task. They had little reason to suspect they were being followed. Boyd and I had watched as they spoke briefly with a group of 3 other men milling around the car park at the Bristol football ground. The place was buzzing. Football supporters spilled out of minibuses, fathers clutched their sons' hands, and groups of friends snaked through the cars towards the stadium. I watched as Ferris peeled away from Horne, who filtered his way through into the VIP parking area. I called Boyd, telling him to make certain he followed Horne. I watched as Ferris started talking animatedly on his mobile telephone, and I could tell from his body language and his regular glances he was more concerned with knowing exactly what was happening in the VIP-only parking area. I drew the lapels of my jacket high against my chin and adjusted the beanie to cover the tops of my ears. Standing around was making me feel colder than I had in years, so I decided to move around a bit. I spotted 2 Land Rover Discoveries and set out on a circuitous route, hoping I could use them as a shield so neither Ferris nor Horne would notice me. Once I'd reached the first of the 4x4 vehicles, my mobile buzzed to life. A top-of-the-range Lexus 4x4 has arrived, Boyd whispered. Horne is taking an interest in the driver. I looked around for the 4x4 and noticed Ferris walking back towards the stadium. I saw a man wearing an expensive-looking 3/4 leather jacket passing a steward at the entrance of the VIP car park. Horne nowhere in sight. I stepped back and then, not wanting to lose sight of the Lexus driver, paced up to the end of the row. I dodged behind a Vauxhall Astra and then alongside a couple of BMWs, all the while keeping the leather jacket clearly visible. He was walking briskly towards the stadium entrance, and then I saw 2 men wearing hoodies walking towards him. The Lexus owner seemed like a magnet. I glanced towards the stadium, but there were no CCTV cameras pointing in my direction. It all happened very quickly. Another man emerged from somewhere and collided into the Lexus owner. He stumbled and fell. By now the hooded men were near him, and they reached down and fussed over the prostrate car owner. They helped him to his feet, but even I could tell they had helped themselves to much more. He dusted himself off, seemed to exchange words with his helpers,
and I watched as they melted away into the crowd. I craned to see if Ferris was anywhere nearby, but I didn't catch sight of him for another 10 minutes, when he returned, walking casually, mobile telephone pinned to his ear. I retreated quickly towards the bottom of the row of cars, taking off my beanie, which I stuffed into a pocket, hoping the change of appearance wouldn't attract attention. I rang Boyd. "What's happening?" I hissed, into a hand cupped over my mobile. "Horn has reappeared from somewhere. I've noticed one of those big Mercs parking. He must be waiting somewhere in the shadows. Wait! He's moving!" The seconds dragged, until Boyd rang me back, warning me Horn had spotted another unsuspecting car owner. I moved back towards one of the 4x4 vehicles, and as I did so, caught sight of Ferris standing, mobile phone at his ear, a hand fluttering the air. At least he was trying to make a performance. This time, they allowed the car owner to walk a little further, until he was stopped by Ferris, and then, as they talked, the two men with hoodies reappeared, staggering around before bumping into Ferris and the other man. Their body language apologized, but all they needed was seconds for hands to dip into his pockets before they faded back into the crowd. By then, I'd seen enough. I called Boyd. "That's two. What do we do, boss?" There was every possibility that both the Lexus 4x4 and the Mercedes were going to be stolen. Time was against us. Ferris and Horn were probably walking over towards the vehicles as we talked. I should be contacting the owners, or at least stopping their vehicles being stolen. But doing that meant I'd never have the chance of finding out who was behind the thefts. That person might well have been responsible for Westford's death. We followed them. Boyd and I sat in our cars, waiting for the Lexus and Mercedes to appear. I checked my watch every 5 minutes, until an agonizing 30 minutes passed. Fewer and fewer cars had been parked as time for kickoff approached. Once the game had started, the stewards at the VIP entrance went to sit in a small hut. I squinted over and saw them drinking from small plastic cups. There was probably a radio playing the commentary of the game. Minutes later, I saw the Lexus moving and tapped out a message to Boyd. I squeezed the steering wheel, clenched my jaw, and watched as the Lexus approached the exit, the yellow barrier lifting open. The stewards paid it little attention, and the 4x4 pulled away. I started the engine and followed him. Boyd had instructions to follow the Mercedes. The Lexus kept under the speed limit as it wound its way through the suburbs of Bristol. I half expected it to head towards the port, but he indicated for the M32 motorway, taking him north out of the city. This route led to the M4, which would take him west towards the Severn Bridge and over towards Cardiff. But he never made it that far, indicating left for Hambrook. I followed through the suburbs of Bristol until, after various side streets, he pulled into an industrial estate and then into a unit owned by a freight forwarding company. I drove on and then turned around, parking the car well away from any prying eyes. Thankfully, the unit abutted a piece of disused ground, and I scrambled up through clumps of weeds and rubbish until I reached higher ground, elevated above the unit. I could see 3 men standing by the Lexus. In one corner was a large container. Moments later, one of the men got into the Lexus and drove it slowly into the container. I could make out the owner's logo on the container, but I strained to make a note of a series of numbers and letters at its base. Centrally located for the M4 and M5 motorways, and near the docks in Bristol, the unit was an ideal location. I slid down the bank, using my fleece-gloved hands to break my fall. I sat in my car, smoking a cigarette, wondering if I should now be calling the Avon and Somerset police. After all, I had witnessed a crime. I knew where the perpetrators could be located. It was one of those decisions I could live to regret. I thought about Terry, realizing I had to protect him. Ferris and Horn were small players. I called Boyd. "I'm following the Mercedes now, boss." "In what direction?" "He's travelling north on the M32. 20 minutes later, Boyd slipped into the passenger seat. I gave him a brief summary of what I had seen earlier before we left, and scrambled back up to the vantage point. There was no Mercedes in sight. A tractor unit reversed towards the container, 2 men securing the door. They worked quickly, and a few minutes later the container was securely fastened. Boyd and I rushed back to the car, just in time to watch, as it drove out of the industrial unit. The suburbs of Bristol were quiet, and 20 minutes later the container disappeared into the entrance of Avonmouth Docks. Boyd and I found a cafe nearby that served strong coffee and bacon sandwiches on enormous thick slices of white bread. "What do we do, boss?" It was the second time that night I had avoided his question. I stirred a spoon lazily through my coffee. Only one thing we can do now. Chapter 12. Sunday, 7:30 a.m. Couldn't sleep, I said. Boyd looked as bad as I felt. Eyes swollen, dark rings underneath, and a grey tiredness that tugs at your back and burns your eyes. I'd slept only 4 hours, awaking from a vivid dream of peering over a conference table at Cornock and Hobbs, who leered at me as though I should have known better. It had been late when we had completed all the relevant notifications to the Avon and Somerset police. The duty inspector at the station in central Bristol sounded wary, as I explained why we were following Ferris and Horn. Within an hour, a customs officer had arrived. He had wandering eyes and a twitching jaw, as though he was aching to punch someone. My comments about wanting to protect my source information were met with silent derision. "Go back to Wales. We'll deal with this," he had said, eventually. It had been 2 in the morning when we drove back into Cardiff. I lay on my bed staring at the ceiling. Although my body shouted at me to sleep, my mind forced me awake. The door of the incident room crashed open. A cleaner stood there, surprised, then stammered an apology and left. I stepped towards the board and peered at the image of Westford and then Clayton and Haddock. "When are they raiding the container?" Boyd said. "They're going to text me." He glanced at his watch. "I'll call Avon and Somerset for an update." I wandered back to my desk. I sank into my office chair and rubbed my hands over my face. My eyes felt sticky. There was a little over 24 hours remaining until the meeting with Hobbs, when I'd have to explain everything that had happened. I read again statements from Kylie Westford and Eddie's sister. I searched for inspiration but found none. Everything pointed to Westford having a source of income that low-level drug dealing wouldn't explain. I scoured the statements gathered by the uniformed officers from various members of the public outside the Cardiff City Stadium on the night Westford was killed, for something we might have missed. In the background, I heard Boyd's voice, and, seeing him in the doorway of my office, I ushered him in. "I've spoken with a sergeant in the Avon Somerset Police. Apparently, 3 other cars were stolen last night. 2 new BMWs and an old E-Type Jaguar." "Did all the owners lose their keys?" Boyd nodded. "I'm amazed that nobody has seen this pattern before." "You know how it is. It's an isolated incident, a one-off. It's given a low priority and nobody thinks to mention to other forces there were 4 car thefts when Cardiff played their local team. And Cardiff play each team once away from home, so the pattern would go unnoticed. Top of the class, Sergeant Pierce." Boyd left, and I got back to picking up the rest of my inquiry, trying to compose some sort of a report for Hobbs and Cornock that would not make me look a complete idiot. I wasn't having much success. I found the YouTube video of Michael Haddock smiling to the camera as he sauntered through his collection of classic cars. I spotted an old Morris Minor Traveller, its wood trim shining alongside the gleaming paint of the bodywork. He suggested an old Ferrari, his pride and joy, was probably worth about £40,000. He laughed off any suggestion that he was obsessive. Haddock regularly featured in the Cardiff press, and I found a picture of him with his son, Jason, announcing a new product his company had developed. It all sounded too good to be true, and I had the feeling I had missed something. I noticed the time and realised I should call the customs officer in Bristol. "Bad timing. Can't talk now," the custom officer barked down the telephone. Unnerved, I sat chewing a nail, wondering if anything had gone wrong at Bristol docks. It was another 15 minutes before he rang me back. "Complete waste of fucking time." My mouth suddenly dried. I drew my tongue over parched lips. "The container was full of garden furniture. Tables and chairs, not even a toy car in sight." "I don't understand." "I need to make a report." "Was it the right container?" "Don't be stupid. It was the one you told us about." "There must be some—" But the line was dead. I slammed down the handset as Boyd walked into my room. "Bad news?" "The container was full of garden furniture." Boyd frowned. "We must have followed the wrong container." "But they must have switched containers before we met up. It's hard to believe." I slammed a fist onto the table. It wasn't going to help. It wouldn't change anything. "So we don't know where either of these new cars have gone,
And apart from the vintage Jag, cars worth $250,000 were nicked last night. They're all on their way to Nigeria or somewhere similar. Something Boyd said stuck in my mind. What did you just say? I don't... Vintage cars. How many vintage cars were stolen when Cardiff City played away from home? I need to check, boss. Do it, now. There's something else I need to check. I found a list of Jaguar XK Type R owners and, ignoring the name of Mrs. Clayton, I focused on the various limited companies. It was the one thing we hadn't checked. There were a dozen companies, and I punched in the details of each into a Google search. The barest details appeared on screen of director and registered address. My breathing became shallow as I reached the end of the list, with each unfamiliar name only aggravating my anxiety. I tapped in the name of Bell Kingston Limited, the 10th company, and stared at the screen, barely believing the name I was reading. Jason Haddock was its director. I stood up abruptly, pushed the chair against the radiator, and then strode out into the incident room. Jason Haddock owns a Jaguar XK Type R. I thought... The car is registered to a limited company. Boyd nodded his recognition. I checked through the details of the reported car thefts around the dates of the Cardiff City games. None of them were vintage cars. I dragged my fingers over my cheeks, down across my lips, wondering what the hell we were doing. I stumbled over my words. Michael Haddock's business is in trouble. It has been for several years. He has to refinance through some bank in Nigeria which he visits regularly. And we know stolen luxury cars often end up in that part of the world. Even if he gets a fraction of what the cars are worth, he would still be making enough money to help with his cash flow. Boyd stood up and marched over to the board. And he uses Westford and the likes of Ferris and Horn as drivers. Westford must have got greedy. His son saw him arguing with somebody. Then another piece of the jigsaw fell into place. Of course. Of course. Find the young lad's statement. Boyd flicked through the paperwork and pulled out a brief statement from Hartley Westford. What are you looking for, boss? He pushed it over in my direction. I sat down and focused on reading the statement. It was halfway down the second page. I stopped, blinked, and then reread the sentence. Dad was talking to a man who looked like a seagull had pooed on his hair. Here it is, I said, handing the statement to Boyd with my finger pointing at the relevant section. Then I walked back into my room and clicked through into the images I had seen earlier that morning. I shouted at Boyd, and when he reached my desk, I had the image of Michael Haddock and his son open on the screen. Jason Haddock's flash of white hair above his left ear was clear for all to see. Chapter 13. Sunday, 11:30 a.m. Superintendent Cornock opened his eyes wide enough for the whites to glisten in the artificial light of his office. Then he stared at me as though I had taken leave of my senses, and that any minute he would have to call for paramedics to remove me. "It's the evidence of a child, for Christ's sake!" I paused, crossing one leg over the other knee. Cornock drew a hand over his hair and blew out a mouthful of air. "John, you're asking me... Let's go through this again." I went over the evidence again. Once I had finished, I realized that I wouldn't even be able to convince myself. The 2 cars we had seen stolen were in a container we couldn't trace, in a port we couldn't locate, being prepared for loading to a country we couldn't identify. And I was trying to persuade my senior officer we should raid the home of an upstanding member of the Cardiff community. Ferris and Horn are involved in a major organised crime group targeting luxury cars. I accept that. It's the link to Haddock that worries me. He has links with West Africa and his business is struggling. Look, you know how these things work. We need a search warrant. Can you imagine the reaction from a magistrate? They all probably play golf with Haddock. An awkward silence filled the room as Cornock stared at the brief summary I had prepared for him. He sighed, turning one of his expensive fountain pens through his fingers. The last thing I wanted was more delay, and when he glanced at the telephone on his desk, I could sense his mind contemplating consulting a superior officer. A brief text arrived on my mobile telephone. It was from Boyd, relaying a message from the plain-clothed detectives I'd requisitioned the night before to stake out Haddock's luxury property. "Ferris and Horn have just arrived.
A buzz of excitement pulsed through my body. I looked over at Cornoc's anguished face. Michael Haddock has just had some guests arrive. Ferris and Horn. The whites of his eyes glistened again, but this time the relief was evident as he forced a grin. "What are you waiting for?" I left his office and marched back to the incident room where Boyd was already on his feet. "Superintendent Cornock has authorized an arrest." Boyd punched the air, then reached for the phone. "I'll tell the DC at Haddock's property." "We'll need a team and a full complement of CSIs," I said, making for my room. Half an hour later, I sat in the passenger seat of the pool car, clutching the search warrant in my hands, as Boyd hammered along Newport Road out of Cardiff towards the motorway. Regular contact with the officer outside Haddock's property kept us up to date, and I was relieved nobody had left and nobody else had arrived. The sat-nav took us along the motorway for a few miles before we indicated off towards the countryside around Abergavenny. We parked some distance from the entrance and called the detective sitting in his car nearby. "All quiet," he replied when I asked him if anything had changed. We waited until the second car with the search team pulled up behind us, and then my mobile rang. It was Alvin Dix. "I hope this isn't a wild goose chase, Marco." Then I saw the scientific support vehicle slowing behind us. "Just wait for my signal," I snapped before finishing the call. I glanced over at Boyd and nodded. He accelerated through the gates, and the search team car followed us. Through an avenue of silver birch trees, we descended until we reached an opening that led to a gravelled area near the main entrance to Haddock's Georgian manor house. The front elevation of the building was perfectly proportioned, with 2 large windows either side of an ornate front door. I jumped out and realized there were no cars in sight. The second car drew to a halt behind us, both officers joining Boyd and I. I waved a hand to both of them. "We'll go round the back. There must be some outbuildings. You try the front door first." Boyd and I jogged round to the rear of the building, passing a walled garden to our left. We reached the back of the property. Even for a Sunday, it all felt eerily quiet. Fear gripped my chest, that we were too late, and that there was some other exit. Boyd rattled the rear door, which was securely locked, and I jogged over a cobbled area, one side of which was occupied by 3 cottages. On the other was a large wooden gate set into the side of a building that probably had a courtyard behind it. I wondered if this might be the home of Haddock's classic car collection. Boyd had been peering into one of the cottages before joining me. "They look empty, boss." The other plainclothes officers ran into the cobbled square. "Ferris and Horn are here somewhere." I pointed the 2 officers towards the cottages, shouting instructions for them to search each one as Boyd and I headed for the large wooden gate. I heaved open the latch and leant my shoulder onto it, surprised how easy it moved on its hinges. We walked into the small courtyard. No vehicles, but there was the sound of muffled conversation from a half-opened window in one corner. We made our way towards the nearby doorway. It squeaked open as I pushed it, and I cursed silently, grimacing to Boyd. At the end of a small corridor, the noise gradually emerged into 3 different voices. Despite the occasional squeak from the floorboards underneath my feet, we walked towards the door at the end. I nodded to Boyd as we paused and opened the door. A long, wide garage opened in front of us with a dozen or more classic cars parked in rows. Deborah Clayton and Jason Haddock looked over at us with hard, dark stares. I scanned the room for Michael Haddock without success, as my mind made the connections I should have seen all along. Chapter 14. Monday, 9:30 a.m. "He's threatened to make a complaint." Cornock sounded justifiably dismissive. The look on Michael Haddock's face when he returned home the previous evening to see a full CSI team working on his classic car collection had stayed in my mind. In fact, it was better than a night at the theatre. He ranted and swore at Boyd and me, demanded to know what was going on before trying to order a young investigator out of a gleaming Ferrari. We found the E-Type Jaguar in the locked garage, and Jason had the only key. I should have seen the connection sooner. Hartley Westford confirmed that he saw his dad talking to someone who had long hair like his dad. We spoke to him again yesterday, and we showed him the picture of Deborah Clayton from behind. He confirmed it could be her. Cornock nodded. And Haddock has a patch of white hair just as Hartley describes. Once Ferris and Horn started talking, we got a full picture of Jason Haddock. Quite the megalomaniac. He loved to beat the shit out of anyone who argued with him. Apparently he just loved the buzz of stealing cars and using the Soul crew to do his dirty work for him. Westford was one of their regular drivers, but he got greedy and wanted more money, so they killed him. I stared at the preliminary forensic report on my lap, and then reached over and plonked it down on Cornock's desk. Alvine has been working overtime. She reckons the knife we found in Mrs. Clayton's car could be the knife that sliced open Westford's throat. It was a medical scalpel, which she denies knowing anything about, but which she probably stole from her father. Cornock scanned the report, making approving noises as he finished reading the final paragraph. I continued. And we know the Claytons lied about visiting Westford, thanks to the evidence of that woman in the bottom-floor flat. Cornock nodded. Thank goodness for nosy neighbours. I stood up and made to leave. The tropical fish tank hummed in the background, and it surprised me how Cornock could work with the constant sound. When are you interviewing Deborah Clayton? Later this afternoon. Good work, John. I thanked him, pleased with the recognition, and left him to the mound of paperwork on his desk. I got back to the incident room and Hobbs stood in front of the board, the rest of the team still finishing the search at Haddock's property. I hear you've had a busy weekend. He made it sound like a criticism, as though I'd taken unauthorized leave. I still got a live inquiry into Gregory Clayton. He wasn't even convincing himself. That investigation would grind on for weeks, maybe longer. Hobbs might get a conviction against a low-level dealer, but if Clayton was involved, he would have made himself bomb-proof by now. I leant against the desk. If there's anything I can do to help, just contact me. For a moment, Hobbs hesitated. Various nerves twitched on his face. I'm sure we'll be fine, he managed through gritted teeth. Monday, 2:45 p.m. The smell in the interview room at Queen Street never changed. It was dull and heavy and lifeless. The drone of the air-conditioning unit hummed in the background as I entered and, closing the door, cut off the sound of activity from the custody suite. I sat down with Boyd by my side. I stared over at Deborah Clayton, who blinked and glanced at her lawyer for reassurance. He gave her a brief smile. The one-piece white standard-issue clothing made her look like any other suspect in custody. She looked pasty, unhealthy, but suspects often do, after a couple of hours in a police cell. She reached over and picked up the small beaker of water. Her hands shook slightly. Once the formalities were finished, I sat back and looked over at her. She averted her eyes. You're under arrest for the murder of Eddie Westford. She shook her head slowly. I'll need you to answer my questions for the purposes of recording the interview. My client has the right to remain silent. I'm sure you don't need me to remind you, Inspector, Clayton's lawyer said. Antagonizing a lawyer never worked, so I gave him a narrow smile and carried on. Were you having a relationship with Jason Haddock? It was nothing. She stared down at her hands. I scanned the notes I had made of the interview I'd just completed with Jason Haddock. His recollection of their passionate love affair was quite different. How long had you been in a relationship with him? She pouted. I would hardly call it a relationship. Jason Haddock had used words like passionate and determined to describe her behaviour as she pursued him into her bed, and insatiable when she succeeded. So who started things between you two? He pursued me relentlessly, and I was at such a low ebb. Things hadn't been right with Gregory, and I know it was wrong, but Jason took advantage of me. She flashed her eyelids at me, but I turned back to Jason's statement, and by the time I had finished, she had angled her body to face her lawyer. After half an hour, she had denied every assertion from Jason's picture of their liaison with short sentences and widening eyes. Tell me about the afternoon that Eddie Westford was killed. I had nothing to do with it. I sat back in the hard plastic chair. I'd had enough of her lies for one day, but I gathered my patience and continued. You were seen with Jason at the Cardiff City football ground arguing with Westford a week before he was killed. And who is your source for that information? I had learnt long ago that challenging our source was a sure indication of guilt. Denial never worked. She tried the same tack when I challenged her about visiting Westford's flat. Finally, I asked her about the murder weapon. "We found a knife in your car. We believe it may have been used to slit open Eddie Westford's throat." I slid over the table a picture of Westford on the mortuary gurney. She recoiled away. "Don't blame me. It was Jason. I had nothing to do with killing this poor man." Jason had said the same thing, and with each blaming the other, it might be up to the jury to decide. At least Jason had admitted his role in the car thefts. I finished the interview after another bout of questions that told me nothing new. I left her in the custody suite with her lawyer. Boyd and I stood outside Queen Street, the evening air fresh and clean on our faces. "She's a lying bitch," Boyd said. I nodded. "I'd be inclined to agree with you, Boyd." Chapter 15. Cardiff Crown Court, several weeks later. I walked over to the court building, crossing Gorsedd Garden, smoking a cigarette. I tucked my scarf nearer to my chin against the chill wind that whipped around my face. Steam billowed from a burger van parked near the museum, and I idly contemplated something greasy to eat once I'd finished in court. Television crews, crowded outside the court, got excited when they saw me approaching. Realizing I wasn't some celebrity or family, they ignored me. It suited me fine. I threw the butt into a bin and entered the building. Lawyers teamed around. Michael Haddock opened and then closed his mouth, obviously unable to think of anything to say. Gregory Clayton's cheeks were more sunken than I remembered, and he gave me a cursory nod. Air conditioning cooled the back of the courtroom. The morning newspaper on the bench by my side carried the story that Michael Haddock's business had been taken over, and that he was retiring to a farm in West Wales. A spokesperson had asked the press to respect the family's privacy. Kylie Westford and Hartley had been spoken to before the case, and warned that they might get the press calling them. "I never thought you'd get at them who killed him," she had said. "Our sort of people never get justice." She smiled when I told her that I would never have given up on the case. Murder is murder, no matter who the victim might be, and people are never what they seem. Westford could never have thought that mixing with Deborah Clayton and Jason Haddock would mean his death. It felt good to feel that my instincts about the likes of Haddock and Clayton were justified. I wondered who might take their place on the forum. I'd seen various emails from Cornock referring to the next meeting. I might even enjoy going. All my work had been done. Now I had to wait for the final part of the system to take its course. Neither Jason nor Deborah Clayton flinched when they were sentenced to life in prison. The discovery of minute traces of Westford's blood on the knife found in Deborah's car made their guilty pleas inevitable. Ferris and Horn would serve 6 years for theft, but their earlier guilty pleas had meant a degree of leniency. Outside, I passed Gregory Clayton and noticed tears in his eyes. I buttoned up my overcoat. The promised snow had not yet arrived. I banged fleece-clad hands together and headed back for Queen Street. The end.